It was a 3-day journey through the fog to Greyhall. The lookouts had spotted a gray wall in the hills and swore it was creeping faster than any caravan. Anyone who breathed in that fog lost their memory in a single night, and by the third dawn, they were no longer human. Aiden stood on the eastern wall and looked out at the hills. The wall of fog rose above the forest to a height of 3 bell towers. It did not disperse in the wind, it breathed. Down by the well, his sister Mara sat bandaging her arm. A week ago, a tongue of fog had reached the distant pasture and brushed against her wrist. Since then, she had been forgetting little things. Yesterday, she forgot the name of their late mother. This morning, she asked Aiden for directions to their own home. The healer said that the curse is progressing slowly because the touch was brief. The healer said she had a month, then she would forget her own name, and that's when the transformation would begin. Aiden gripped the railing so tightly that his knuckles turned white. A month. He had a month, and he had nothing but a pair of working hands and the debts. He worked as a cart driver, hauling cargo between Grey Hall and the mills. Now the roads were dying, one by one. The fog was devouring them, along with the villages. The sentry, Toller, stopped by the wall nearby. He said that the old lighthouse keeper, Olam Tarn, had died that night. He said that before he died, the old man had repeated Adin's name 3 times and insisted that Adin and no one else be summoned. Toller smirked and added that the lighthouse keeper, who had lost his mind, had chosen a penniless cart driver as his heir. Aiden didn't reply. Olam Tarn was the only person who had ever ventured into the fog and returned. Everyone considered him a madman. Aiden climbed down from the wall and walked toward the keeper's house on the edge of the village. The house stood right next to the palisade. Inside, it smelled of kerosene and dried herbs. An old kerosene lantern lay on the table. Its copper body had darkened with age. The glass was as cloudy as a river ice. Next to it lay a note scrawled by a trembling hand. The old man wrote that the lantern chooses its bearer itself. The old man wrote that light reveals the truth and the mist is a lie. The old man wrote that for every settlement saved from the fog, the light grows wider. The last line was short. Go west toward the sleeper and do not extinguish the flame. Aiden decided it was the ramblings of a dying man. Then he picked up the lantern, and the body grew warm in his palm as if it were alive. The wick flared to life on its own. No one had lit it. The flame burned with an even white light and produced no soot. Aiden recoiled and nearly dropped the lantern. The light spread in a circle with a radius of 5 steps. Inside the circle, the world had changed. The floorboard by the threshold glowed red. Aiden crouched down and pried it up with his knife. Beneath the floorboard was a pit filled with stakes. The old man had protected the house with traps, and the light had revealed the trap through the wood. The far wall glowed green. Aiden tapped on it and found a hiding place. Inside the hiding place lay 3 bottles of kerosene, a bag of hardtack, a hunting knife, and a map of the western lands. 12 settlements were marked on the map in a chain stretching all the way to the sea. Near the farthest mark, the old man had drawn a closed eye and written a single word: sleeping. Aiden stood in the middle of a stranger's house with a lit lantern, listening to his heart. The light revealed what was hidden. Traps glowed red, valuables glowed green. If the old man hadn't lied about the rest, this lantern was worth more than all of Greyhall. Outside, a bell rang. 3 strikes, an alarm at the gate. Aiden grabbed the lantern and ran out into the street. A crowd had gathered at the west gate. A man stood outside the gate asking to be let in. Aiden pushed his way to the front and recognized Harvick, the blacksmith from the village of Lofen. Lofen had been engulfed by fog 5 days ago. Harvick looked unharmed. He spoke calmly. He addressed people by name. He asked for the gate to be opened because a misty horde was following him down the road. Toller was already reaching for the bolt. Aiden raised the lantern above his head. The white light swept over the palisade and fell on Harvick. The crowd screamed. In the lantern's light, the blacksmith was not human. The light revealed a long gray body woven from mist and bones. Instead of a face, the creature had a smooth mask of frozen mist with Harvick's features painted upon it. The creature realized it had been exposed. It dropped the pretense and slammed into the gate with all its might. The bolt cracked. Toller fell onto his back and crawled backward. The gate panel buckled, and a gray hand with 6 fingers slipped through the crack. People fled from the gate. Aiden didn't run. He saw in the lantern light that the creature's chest glowed with a red dot, like a trap under a floorboard. The light revealed vulnerability just as it revealed danger. Aiden snatched the old man's hunting knife, and when the creature smashed through the gate, he stepped toward it instead of retreating. The creature hadn't expected this. Its blow sailed over Aiden's shoulder and smashed the cart behind him. Aiden drove the knife into the red spot up to the hilt. The creature made a sound like the wind whistling through a chimney. Then it crumbled. It didn't fall. It crumbled into gray sand that was immediately sucked back into the ground. A mask bearing the blacksmith's face remained lying on the sand. The mask was the last to melt away. It grew very quiet. Toller sat on the ground and looked up at Aiden. An hour ago, he had been laughing at the poor cart driver. Now he was looking at the man who had seen the monster through another's face and killed it with a single blow. Toller slowly stood up and asked Aiden what that light was. Aiden looked at the lantern. The flame burned evenly and the lantern's body was warm. A thin, glowing line appeared along the copper rim around the glass, 1 line out of 12 divisions, like on a clock face. Aiden recalled the words from the note. For every settlement saved, the light grows wider. He had just saved Greyhall from the beast at the gate, and the lantern had counted it. The circle of light at his feet grew noticeably larger. It had been 5 steps. Now it was 8. People were returning to the gate and gathering around the circle of light. No one dared to step inside without permission. Old woman Beth was the first to step into the light and began to cry. She said that for the first time in a month, the back of her head wasn't aching. She said that in this light, the foggy fear was lifting. Others stepped into the circle and said the same thing. The light didn't just reveal the truth. The light kept the fog at bay and healed its scars. Aiden thought of Mara, and his throat went dry. He ran across the square toward the well. Mara was sitting in the same spot, staring at her bandaged arm as if she were seeing it for the first time. Aiden held the lantern up. The light fell on her wrist, and beneath the bandage, a gray pattern of a curse became visible. The pattern resembled tree roots embedded in her skin. In the white light, the roots stirred and receded. They did not disappear. They retreated half a finger's width and froze. Mara looked up and, for the first time in a week, called her brother by name immediately and without hesitation. Aiden realized 3 things at once. The light holds back the curse, but does not remove it. Only the death of the one who gives birth to the mist will lift the curse, and he now has a path to the west, marked by the hand of the dead watchman. That evening he was summoned to the assembly hall. Elder Greven sat at the head of the table, staring at the lantern rather than at Aiden. Greven said that such a thing could not belong to a single person. Greven said that the lantern must be kept by the council, and that trusted individuals would take turns carrying it. The guards at the door placed their hands on their axes. Aiden set the lantern in the middle of the table and invited any member of the council to light it. Greven nodded to his nephew. The nephew took the lantern, and the flame went out. The room was plunged into darkness. The nephew shook the lantern, twisted the wick, and held a splinter of wood to it. The lantern stood lifeless and cold. Then Aiden reached out, and as soon as his fingers touched the brass, a white flame flared up of its own accord. A collective sigh swept through the room. Aiden repeated the old man's words that the lantern chooses its bearer. He said he was ready to defend Greyhall, but the lantern would go with him, not with the council. Greven was silent for a long time. Then he said that the sentries had seen something ominous. The wall of fog in the hills had changed direction. Before, it had been creeping south along the river. And now it had turned around and was heading straight for Greyhall. It was moving faster than before. It moved as if it had sensed something. Grevin looked at the white flame and said aloud what everyone was thinking. The mist had sensed the lantern, the mist was following the light, and there were no longer 3 days left until its arrival, but 2. For 2 days, Grey Hall prepared for death or for a miracle. Aiden slept for 3 hours at a time and spent the rest of the time walking through the village with a lantern. The light revealed what had been accumulating over the years. A rotten section of the palisade near the livestock yard glowed red. They took it down and replaced it with fresh logs. The roof of the meeting house, where a beam had cracked last winter, glowed red. The courtyard of the late merchant Mel's lit up green. Under the shed, they unearthed a barrel of salted meat and a box of arrowheads that no one had known about. People followed Aiden in a crowd and gazed at the circle of light as if it were a living creature. The circle had a radius of 8 paces. Aiden tested something else as well. Inside the circle, everything built there changed. He drove an ordinary stake into the ground and left it in the light overnight. By morning, the wood had become as hard as an old oak and glowed faintly along its grain. The carpenter, Rome, struck the stake with an axe, and the axe bounced off, leaving a white notch. Rome was silent for a long time, then said that if they lined the gate with such stakes, even a battering ram could break through them. Thus, a plan was born. All the logs for the gate and the corner towers were placed in the circle of light, one by one. Aiden set up a lantern at the construction site and stood nearby because without him, the flame would go out. He fell asleep with Edgar standing up. Mara brought him food and made sure he didn't fall. Her hand hurt less in the lantern's light, but the gray roots under her skin hadn't gone anywhere. Every morning, Aiden checked their length with a piece of string. The roots didn't grow as long as she spent the night near the light. It was not peace, but a reprieve. At noon on the second day, refugees arrived from the Eastern Road. 40 people from the vanished village of Lofen. They had walked for 3 days without sleep along the river. Aiden met them at the gate with a lantern and shone the light on each one. 38 were human. 2 were masks. The 2 creatures had walked among the exhausted people for 3 days, eating their food and calling their neighbors by name. When the light stripped away their deception, the crowd of refugees screamed so loudly that crows took flight from the palisade. The creatures scattered in different directions. Aiden stabbed one in the red spot with his knife. The second was driven toward the river, where it crumbled in the light as Aiden ran closer. After that, no one in Grey Hall argued anymore about whether the council needed a lantern or a carrier. Fog rolled in at night. It didn't come as a wall, but as fingers. Dozens of gray tongues crept down from the hills into the lowlands, encircling the settlement on 3 sides. The sentries rang the bell until Grevin ordered them to stop because the ringing was driving people mad. Aden climbed the gate tower and raised the lantern. The light reached 8 paces into the darkness, and beyond that lay a shifting mist. Creatures emerged from the mist into the light. The first wave was spotted at the northern wall. 20 gray bodies were scrambling up the palisade, clinging to it with their 6-fingered hands. The logs exposed to the light burned their palms like red-hot iron. The creatures howled like furnace pipes and tumbled back down. Those that climbed over in the dark spots were struck by arrows. Aiden ran along the wall with a lantern, and wherever its light fell, the men stopped trembling and began to hit their targets. He saw red dots on the gray bodies and shouted to the archers where to aim. After his 3rd point-blank hit, the archer Finn burst into maniacal laughter and shouted that with this light, even he couldn't miss. By midnight, the attacks had merged into a single onslaught. Fog realized the wall couldn't be taken and called for the big one. The ground shook. A creature as tall as a tower emerged from the mist toward the gates. It was assembled from dozens of masks. The entire faces of people long since devoured covered its body like scales, and all those faces were moving their lips. The people on the wall heard the faces whispering their names. The guard Olm heard the voice of his drowned daughter and stepped off the tower before they could seize him. He did not fall to his death, but vanished into the darkness beyond the wall, and his voice joined the whispers. Graven stood in the square and prayed to every god he could think of. Auden looked at the giant through the light and couldn't find the red dot. The light fell on the masks, and the masks simply turned toward him like sunflowers toward the sun. The creature struck the gate. The new logs held, but the tower swayed. A second blow knocked Aiden off balance, and the lantern nearly flew downward. And then Mara, who had climbed the tower in defiance of orders, grabbed her brother by the sleeve and shouted that the spot was there, but it wasn't on the creature's body. With her eyes clouded by the fog, she could see a little more than ordinary people. She shouted that the giant was holding the red spot above itself, deep within the mist. Aiden raised the lantern on his outstretched arm toward the sky. The light shot straight up, and there, high above the giant's head, a knot hung in the fog. A thick gray cord extended from the back of the creature's head into the cloudy mist like an umbilical cord. A red dot glowed at the point where it connected. The creature was not a living being, but a puppet that the fog was leading on a leash. Aiden called out to Finn. Finn was the best archer, but it was 50 paces up to the knot, and in the dark. Aiden stood behind him and held the lantern so that the beam of light lay on the cord like a path. Finn exhaled and released the bowstring. The first arrow flew past the knot. The giant slammed into the gate, and the tower creaked. The second arrow whizzed past the cord. The creature raised its head, and all its faces fell silent at once. It understood. It reached with its hands toward its umbilical cord to cover it. Finn aimed the third arrow at the red dot just as the six-fingered hand was an elbow's length away from it. The knot burst with the sound of a sail tearing. The giant slumped like a sack of sand. Masks rained down from him and melted before they reached the ground. And then something happened that no one had expected. The misty fingers around Greyhall twitched and crept backward. The mist retreated from the walls faster than it had advanced. By dawn, the hills were clear all the way to the forest. People stood on the walls and were silent because they had no words. The lantern in Aiden's hand grew warm. A second glowing line appeared along its rim. The circle of light expanded from 8 paces to 15, but that wasn't all. When Aiden went down to the square and set the lantern on the well house, the light didn't fade back. A transparent dome of faint light stretched from one end of Greyhall to the other, visible only against the backdrop of the night sky. The entire village had become a safe zone. The curse could not enter as long as the lantern burned within its boundaries. Griven approached Aiden in full view of the entire square. The old man, who 2 days earlier had demanded that the lantern be taken away, dropped to one knee in the muddy road. He said he had been blind. He said that Greyhall would give the bearer of light whatever he asked for. Auden lifted the elder by the shoulders and asked for 3 things: kerosene from every yard, 20 volunteers, and a wagon for the journey west to the next settlement on the overseer's map. The crowd buzzed. The people had only just survived, and the bearer of light was about to leave. Aiden raised his lantern and explained what he had come to understand that night. Every settlement saved makes the light spread further. The 12 divisions on the rim represent 12 settlements before the lair of the sleeper who gives birth to the mist. As long as the sleeper lives, the mist will return again and again, and the curse in Mara's hand and in hundreds of other hands will bide its time. There is only one road, and it leads west through 11 dying villages. The people fell silent, and in that silence, the sound of hooves rang out. A convoy was approaching the gates from the southern road. 12 covered wagons, 40 armed horsemen, and a banner bearing golden scales. Toller shouted from the wall that it was the caravan of Cassius Brant, the master of the southern roads. Brant was buying up grain, iron, and people throughout all the surviving lands. The lead horseman blew his horn and demanded that the gate be opened for the caravan's master. Griven turned pale. He told Aiden that Brant never came just like that. He said that 3 weeks ago, Brant had bought up the entire supply of oil and salt from a dying city for a song under the protection of his own swordsman. The horsemen at the gate parted, and a heavy-set man in a fox fur coat rode forward. Cassius Brandt raised his head, surveyed the transparent dome over the settlement, and smiled the way a buyer at a fair smiles. He shouted that the rumors had reached him as early as yesterday. He shouted that he had come to talk about the lantern. And Aiden, standing on the wall, saw in the light of his torch something that sent a chill down his spine. Brandt's 3 horsemen had smooth, gray masks instead of faces. Aiden refused to open the gate and refused to remain silent. He raised the lantern above the wall and shone the light on the 3 horsemen with gray masks. He shouted across the road that Mr. Brandt had brought 3 misty creatures in his retinue. The caravan froze. Brandt turned to his men with the expression of a man who'd just been told his barn was on fire. The creatures realized the deal was off. All 3 leaped from their saddles at once. 1 lunged at Brandt, 2 scattered to the sides toward the wagons where the unarmed drivers sat. What followed were 30 seconds of hoarse screams and white light. Aiden ran down from the wall, ordered the small gate opened, and stepped out onto the road himself, for only his light revealed the red dots. Brandt's guards slashed at the creature at random, and their blades stuck in its gray body as if in wet clay. Aiden ran right up to it, shone his light on the red dot beneath the creature's collarbone, and the nearest guard thrust his sword into that spot up to the hilt. Finn shot the second creature off the wall with an arrow, just as Aiden's light fell on its back. The third had almost reached Brandt's throat. The caravan driver lay on his back in the road dust, clutching his 6-fingered hand with both hands as his strength faded. Aiden set the lantern on the ground a step away from them. Within the white circle, the creature began to smoke. Its grip loosened. Brandt drew a dagger from his boot and struck the red spot himself, which he saw in the light just as clearly as everyone else. The creature crumbled onto his fur coat like gray sand. It grew quiet. 40 horsemen stared at their master, who was sitting in the dust. Brandt stood up, brushed off his fur coat, and gazed for a long time at the sand at his feet. Then he said in a very calm voice that these 3 had served him for 2 years each. He said that one of them had ridden as a messenger to the Misty Lands a month ago and returned a week later. He said that meant he had been sleeping in the same camp for a month with the one who bore his man's face. Brandt turned to Aiden, and the merchant's smile did not return to his face. Instead, there was something honest and fierce. He said he had come here to buy a lantern or to take it by force if the price wasn't right. He said he'd changed his mind in the last 30 seconds. A man who strips the world of its lies cannot be bought or taken away. With such a man, one forms an alliance. There was a bargain after all, though a strange one. Brandt made offers, and Aiden refused. Brandt offered gold, and Aiden said gold couldn't feed the mist. Brandt offered protection for Greyhall, and Gravin shouted from the wall that Strange's blades within the walls were worse than beasts. Then Brandt said what mattered most. He knows the western roads better than anyone alive because he's been driving caravans along them for 20 years. The roads marked on the Overseer's map are half eroded. The village of Solvern is still on the list, but it's surrounded, and the ring is closing in. Without a guide, Aiden will waste a week on dead-end roads, and Solvern doesn't have a week to spare. Brandt's price was simple. His caravan would travel under the protection of the light. His people would receive the right to trade in every fortress the bearer built. The light and trade would go west together, or not at all. Aiden looked at this man and saw in the lamplight what he had always seen. Not a single red dot. Greedy, alive, real. He held out his hand to Brandt, and they shook hands before 200 witnesses. They set out at sunset the next day, 20 volunteers from Greyhall, 12 of Brandt's wagons, and a cart of kerosene that Aiden wouldn't entrust to anyone else. Mara rode in the second wagon. Aiden argued with her until he was hoarse and lost. She said that the curse in her hand could sense the fog before her eyes could see it. She said that on the tower that night, she, not the lantern, had found the giant's red dot. She said that her brother could leave her behind in Greyhall, but then she would follow on foot. Aiden gave in, and from that moment on, Mara became the eyes of the caravan. The road to the west was disappearing in patches. For the first 10 versts, the road was a road. Then the gaps began. Sections where the road was simply gone, not overgrown or washed away, but gone. along with the milestone markers and roadside trees, as if someone had cut out a chunk of the world and sewn up the edges. Brant led the wagon train around these gaps, relying on memory and landmarks. Twice his memory argued with the light, and both times the light was right. At the third gap, the lantern cast a red glow over a flat green meadow directly ahead. Brant swore that a month ago there had been solid pasture here. Aiden threw a stone onto the meadow, and it sank into the grass without a sound or a trace, as if into water. The caravan skirted the meadow in an arc, and all the drivers crossed themselves. And the next day, the light paid off for the first time on the journey. Near the burned-down tavern at the fork in the road, the lantern illuminated an old well in green. At the bottom of the well, beneath a layer of silt, lay 4 sealed barrels of kerosene and a tin box. Olem Tarn, the caretaker, had set up caches all along the road to the west. Inside the tin box was a second map with markings not found on the first. Near the village of Solvern, a small lantern had been drawn by the old man's hand. Next to it was a caption, "The third one was lit here." Aiden lay awake past midnight, staring at that line. The third. So, the lantern in his hands wasn't the only one in the world. That meant there were other bearers and other lights. And that meant that somewhere they were either still burning or had gone out along with their bearers. They reached Solvern on the 5th day and heard it before they saw it. From behind the hill, someone was striking iron. That's not the sound of an alarm. It's the sound of despair. The convoy climbed to the ridge, and the valley opened up below. The village stood on a hill in the middle of the valley, and the entire valley was gray. Fog lay in a ring around Solvern, and the ring was alive. Hundreds of bodies were circling within it. The creatures weren't storming the hill, they were waiting. Mara clenched her mangled hand and said they were waiting for nightfall because by nightfall, the people on the hill would run out of oil for their torches. They couldn't storm the hill, and they couldn't wait. Aiden looked out at the valley and calculated. The radius of the light was 15 paces. The wagon train would break through the ring with a fight, but outside the circle, Brant's men would be blinded, and the ring would devour them. And then Brant explained why the merchants were needed. He asked Aiden if the light would stay on a moving wagon. It would. He asked Aiden what would happen to the logs if they were doused with kerosene and left in the light. Rome, the carpenter who had joined the expedition, said that light-colored wood doesn't burn from an ordinary fire. He had tested it. Brant smiled for the first time in 5 days and ordered the 3 wagons to be unloaded. Before sunset, the wagon train had built something the world had never seen. The 3 wagons were sheathed in light-colored wood, their sides raised to human height, and loopholes cut into them. The result was 3 wooden fortresses on wheels. Aiden stood on the middle one, holding a lantern. The horses were also let into the light, and Mara noticed that within the circle, they stopped being afraid of the fog. At dusk, the 3 wagons rolled down from the ridge and advanced toward the ring in a wedge formation. The creatures turned toward the light, all 100 of them at once. From then on, Aiden remembered not the battle, but the work. The light raced ahead of the wedge, and within its glow, the gray bodies flashed with red dots like stars in the night sky. Archers fired point blank from the embrasures. The creatures scrambled onto the sides and burned their palms on the light-colored wood. The driver of the middle wagon sang a bawdy song at the top of his lungs because silence was more terrifying. The ring turned out to be 40 paces thick. The wedge passed through it in the time it took to say a short prayer and shot out onto the slope of Solvern Hill, leaving behind a trail of settling gray sand. The village gates swung open to meet them. And then what Aiden had been heading west for finally happened. No sooner had the lantern entered Solvern's walls than the flame doubled in size. The 3rd Division flared up on the rim so brightly that Aiden squinted. A dome of light spread over the village hill and crept down its slopes. The misty ring below stirred, receded, and flowed out of the valley like water from a punctured barrel. The circle's radius was now 30 paces. The people of Solvern knelt along the street, and the village elder, a gray-haired woman named Olma, wept without wiping away her tears. She said they had been striking the iron for 3 weeks, and no one had come. She said that yesterday they had sewn the last piece of leather from their boots. She looked up at the lantern and stopped mid-sentence. She stared at the flame as if she recognized it. That night, Olma came to Aiden herself. She brought a bundle of oiled leather and unwrapped it on the table. Inside lay a lantern. The copper body was of the same casting, the same cloudy glass. Only the rim was melted and blackened, and inside, instead of a wick, lay a caked-together lump. Olma said that 20 years ago, a bearer named Kovan lived in Solvern, and his fire was the third in the chain. She said that Kovan had gone west toward the sleeper, just as everyone else had, and returned a year later with no memory, no speech, and no light. The lantern in his hands was dead. Kovan lived another month, and before his death, his mind cleared for a single evening. Olma was just a girl then, but she remembered every word because Kovan had shouted them in his delirium for the whole village to hear. He shouted that he had reached the 11th settlement. He shouted that he had seen the sleeper and that the sleeper had seen him too. And he shouted that the next bearer must never, under any circumstances, believe anyone who emerged from the fog toward him with a green light. The morning in Solvern began with a head count and a troubling discovery. Aiden checked every house one by one with his lantern because the village had been encircled for 3 weeks, and the fog might have left some of its own behind. They'd already checked the people the night before, and all 49 residents were human. But in the mill's cellar, the light illuminated an empty oil barrel in red. Aiden lifted the lid and saw a gray coating at the bottom, resembling mold. Mara touched the coating with her tainted hand and pulled it away. She said it was a seed. She said her hand recognized it the way one recognizes kin. The mist couldn't enter Solvern through their bodies and left a seed that waited for darkness to sprout. The barrel was carried into the circle of light, and the film melted away with a faint hiss. Alma watched this, and her face grew old before their very eyes. She said that the oil in this barrel had been poured in by a peddler who had come to the village a week before the ring. She said that the peddler was cheerful and generous and kept asking where the village kept its winter supplies. Aiden and Brant exchanged glances. The mist had more than just creatures and puppets. The mist had merchants. The caravan had been stationed in Solvern for 3 days, and for those 3 days, Aiden had been building. He'd realized back in Greyhall that the dome would hold, even without him, as long as the lantern remained within the settlement's boundaries. But when he left, he had to leave the light behind. Otherwise, salvation would turn into a mere reprieve. The answer was found on the Overseer's second map. The old man had marked not only the caches, but also strange drawings in the center of each settlement. A tower with a bowl on top. Rome made out in the drawing what Aiden had failed to see. It was a blueprint, a lighthouse tower with a mirrored bowl and a supply of kerosene where the fire is lit not by a match but by the bearer's touch against the base. The caretaker had spent his entire life preparing a chain of lighthouses but hadn't managed to build a single one. Solvern was building a lighthouse for the entire village. The logs were cured within the circle of light. Brant retrieved the mirror for the bowl from his wagons, having torn it from the door of his own travel cabinet. On the third evening, Aiden placed his palm on the base of the tower, and the bowl at the top flared white. The fire burned without a carrier. The dome above Solvern remained standing when Aiden walked out through the gate. As a farewell, Alma repeated Kovan's words about the green fire, and the wagon train set off northwest toward the 4th marker. Ashford was the 4th stop on the route. The quarry town in the foothills was 3 times the size of Greyhall. It was a 4-day journey to get there, and on the second day, the caravan began to catch up with the refugees. First came individuals, then families, then entire processions. They were all coming from Ashford, and they all told the same story. The city hadn't been overrun by the fog. The city had shut itself off. The gates were bolted, and archers on the walls were firing at anyone who approached, while a green fire burned day and night in the gatehouse. Aiden felt a chill between his shoulder blades. The Ash Choir. That's what the refugees called those who had taken the city. They had come to Ashford a month ago out of the fog, 12 men in gray robes with their faces concealed, led by a green glass lantern. They were led by a man who called himself Irvos. The green light also drove away the creatures, and the tormented city welcomed the newcomers as saviors. But then, within a week, everything turned upside down. Ervos declared that the mist was not a punishment, but a sacrament, that the creatures were the liberated. That memory was a burden that the sleeper mercifully lifts from people. Those who disagreed began to be let out through the gates at dawn. They were let out with their hands bound, and the fog took them away before everyone's eyes while the choir sang. Aiden listened to this as he stood by the wagon, his knuckles white against the handle of his lantern. Bran said aloud what he considered obvious. To bypass the city, the chain won't be broken if we take the 5th settlement instead of the 4th. Aiden silently pointed to the lantern's rim. The 3rd section burned evenly, but the 4th spot on the rim was not empty. A thin crack ran along the copper. Aiden had noticed it that morning, and Mara confirmed the worst. Her hand ached in the direction of Ashford. The keeper's chain was not a list, but an order. The beacons must stand one after another in a line, like vertebrae. A missing link broke the spine. The road to the sleeping one led only through the green light. They reached Ashford at sunset on the 4th day and set up camp on the ridge out of firing range. The city lay in a basin, gray and quiet. A green dot burned above the gate tower, and its light made Aiden's teeth chatter. His lantern on the ridge burned steadily, but the flames stretched toward the city as if caught in a draft. The two lights sensed each other. A guest arrived at the camp that night. The sentry sounded the alarm, and the light revealed a solitary figure in the darkness with his hands raised. It was a stonemason named Garth, who had escaped from Ashford through an old adit. They shone their light on him. A man. Garth told them something the refugees did not know. Ervos had known about the convoy's approach for 3 days already and was preparing for its arrival. Tomorrow at dawn, the choir would lead 50 hostages from the families of dissenters out onto the wall. Ervos would announce that if a white fire approached the gates, the hostages would walk into the fog. Garth said something else as well. He had been working on the masonry of the gate tower and had seen Ervos up close without his hood. Ervos has no face. There is a smooth gray expanse on which features emerge only when he speaks. The chorus hides this. The chorus believes that their leader was the first to ascend. Aden didn't sleep until morning. He lay there, sorting through what he had. A storming of the city was impossible because of the hostages. A siege was impossible because of the crack in the rim, which had grown longer over the past 2 days. Negotiating with that creature was pointless. There was only one door left, and that door was madness. Light reveals the truth to all who look upon it. Ervos holds the city in a web of lies, so he must bring light to where the lies dwell and tear them apart before everyone's eyes. In the morning, Aden went out to the gates of Ashford alone, unarmed, with a lantern held high in his hand. Brant yelled at his back that it was suicide. Mara didn't yell. She whispered in her brother's ear that the red dot on people like Ervos is always where people's memories are, and slipped her knife into his sleeve. Hostages stood against the wall with their hands bound, and gray-hooded figures loomed behind them. The gates opened of their own accord. Ervos was clever, and Aden was counting on that. Killing the bear with an arrow from the wall meant turning him into a martyr for his own flock, who were secretly watching the white fire with hope. Ervos wanted to publicly humiliate the white light. He got his publicity. Aden was led into the square, where half the city had been herded. Ervos stood on a platform at the foot of the gate tower beneath his green lantern hanging from a chain. Up close, the green light was beautiful, and its beauty was sickening. It did not illuminate, but rather enveloped everything. The people's faces seemed calm and blurred in its glow. Ervos spoke, and his voice was warm like a doctor's. He told the city that a man had come bearing the fire of fear. That white light reveals the ugliness of the world and multiplies pain, while green light bestows peace. He proposed to Aden an honest contest between the two lights before the eyes of the people. Let each light illuminate the same person, and the city itself will see which truth is kinder. An old woman with her hands bound was led out of the crowd. Garth cringed in the crowd, and Aden realized that this was his mother. Ervos held the green lantern up to her. In the green light, the old woman's face smoothed out, she smiled, and she no longer recognized her son in the crowd. She said she felt fine. She said she remembered nothing, and that was happiness. The crowd swayed toward the platform like grass in the wind, and then Aiden did what he had come to do. He didn't shine the light on the old woman. He stepped past her and raised the white lantern to shine it directly on Ervos himself. The distance was 3 steps. At that distance, you can't even lie to the fog. The white light struck the gray hooded cloak, and the crowd saw. In the white light, the hood became transparent as smoke. There was no head beneath it. There was a smooth gray expanse, and on that expanse, like ink in water, dozens of alien features floated. The noses, lips, and eyebrows of hundreds of devoured faces rose and sank, and in the center of his chest, beneath the hood, a red dot glowed, and around it, like the spokes of a wheel, gray strands radiated outward, disappearing into the ground beneath the platform. Ervos was not the leader of the chorus. Ervos was the root. Everything he had devoured, he held within himself, and for a month the city fed him with memories, leading people out through the gates. The square screamed with one voice. Ervos realized he had lost the argument and ceased to be a preacher. The gray expanse of his face split open like a gaping maw, and his hood burst across his swollen body. He was swift. Aiden was closer. Mara's knife pierced the red spot before the maw closed, and Aiden twisted the blade just as he unleashed all the rage he'd accumulated over the past month. Ervos did not crumble into sand like ordinary creatures. He burst open. What gushed out of him was not sand, but memory. For a moment, the square was swept by a whirlwind of unfamiliar voices, names, and lullabies, and then everything fell silent, and the 50 hostages on the wall screamed in pain as their minds were suddenly unleashed. What had been taken from them had returned. The green lantern on its chain flickered and went out like a gouged-out eye. The crowd tore off their robes. One of the gray-clad figures ran toward the gate, but the crowd didn't catch up to him because they were embracing their own. And Aiden stood on the platform above a pool of melting mist and looked at his lantern. The 4th segment lit up. The crack in the rim closed. The radius expanded to 50 paces, and the dome spread over Ashford. But the flame did not subside. The flame fluttered against the glass like a bird and stretched westward more fiercely than before. Mara climbed onto the platform, stood beside him, and Aden saw her face. She was clutching her injured hand, and the hand was smoking gray in the cold air. She spoke very quietly so that only he could hear. She said that when Ervos burst, something in the west had opened its eyes. She said that it was no longer sleeping fitfully. She said that it had looked this way, and now it knew both of them by name. Ashford provided the foundation that the villages could not. Stone. Now, the city of stonecutters knew how to cut and lay it faster than the fog could wait. Aiden stayed for 6 days, and those 6 days were etched into people's memories as 3 images. The first image. The quarry at dawn, where 100 stonecutters hold stone blocks aloft in a circle of light, and the blocks, after a night in the darkness, ring out like bells under the hammer and do not splinter. The second image, Ashford Lighthouse, 3 times taller than the one at Solvern, rises from the gatehouse exactly where the green lantern once hung, and Garth's elderly mother is the first to bring oil to its bowl. The third image, the convoy heading west, no longer a convoy, but a column. 30 volunteers from Grey Hall and Solvern, 100 Ashford stonemasons with their families, 20 of Brant's wagons, and 3 new stone wagons on oak axles, which Rome dubbed light bearers. Ashford had equipped them himself. The town, which had spent a month sending its people out through the gates, now stood on the ramparts and waved to the departing column until it disappeared over the ridge. The 5th marker on the overseer's map was the Veld, a trading hub at the confluence of 2 rivers, 3 days' journey away. Brant knew it better than his own home because he'd been paying the bridge toll there for 20 years. On the second day of the journey, his knowledge ran out. The road climbed to the watershed, and the column came to a halt. Below lay the confluence valley, and the valley was gone. From horizon to horizon stretched a gray sea. The fog here was not a wisp or a ring, but a solid mass in which both bridges, both rivers, and the entire town of Veld, with its 3,000 inhabitants, had been swallowed up. Only the top of a watchtower jutted out above the gray sea, and on it a faint light from an ordinary campfire flickered. Someone else was still alive at the very top of the submerged city. Mara slid off the wagon and threw up. She said there were a lot of newcomers down below. She said her hand could hear the valley buzzing like a beehive. Brant took off his hat. He said that the Veld had stood here for 400 years. Aiden looked out at the gray sea and made a cold calculation that he himself hated. A radius of 50 paces. The fog was 2 versts thick all the way to the tower. The light bearers would follow the paved road to the bridge, and beyond that lay the bridge, the ford, and the narrow streets beneath the fog where the column would be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. They hadn't slept that night at the watershed. Around midnight, the fog below stirred and gave birth to what Aiden had been waiting for since the day of Ashford. A beast emerged from the gray sea onto the slope. It was the size of a bull and built like a hound. Its body was made of dense mist held together by the ribs of alien bones. It did not attack the column. It sat down at the edge of the light, raised its blind head, and howled. The howl was not a sound, but a subtraction of sounds. Wherever it passed, the campfires ceased to crackle, and the horses fell silent. Mara covered her ears and cried out that the beast wasn't howling, but calling, that it was marking a target for the entire horde, that the sleeper had sent it in their wake all the way from Ashford. Finn shot 4 arrows into the beast, and the arrows passed through the mist as though through smoke, because there was no red dot on the beast at all. It was neither a tethered puppet nor a root. It had been fashioned directly by the sleeper, and only the very edge of light itself could kill it. The beast howled until dawn, and in the morning flowed down into the gray sea. Meanwhile, the column on the ridge was holding a war council. Brant said that the Veld was dead, and they had to admit it honestly. Garth said there was a bonfire on the tower, and they didn't throw living people into it. Rome was silent, drawing with charcoal on a stone. Then he raised his head and asked Aiden whether the lighthouse dome would hold the fog if the lighthouse were lit not in the center of the city, but on the outskirts. Aiden didn't know. The lantern knew the answer. Aiden sat down over the keeper's second map, and in the lantern's light, what had been hidden from the naked eye became visible. Thin green lines connected the markers for the settlements, and tiny numbers stood next to each line. Rome glanced at it and gasped. These were distances, and these were the arcs of the domes. The keeper had calculated the chain so that the domes of neighboring lighthouses would meet at their edges like links in a chainmail. And on the line between Ashford and Veld, right on the watershed where the column now stood, another tower was drawn, one that wasn't on the main list, an intermediate lighthouse. The old man had foreseen that Veld might be submerged and had left a blueprint for a bridge across the gray sea. The plan came together in an hour, and it was daring enough to send a shiver down one's spine. Build a lighthouse here on the ridge. Its dome, following the calculated arcs, would cover the slope and the upper quarter of the valley, pushing the mass away from the road to the first bridge. Then the light bearers would follow the cleared path to the tower, rescue the survivors, and return under the dome. Veld couldn't be saved, but the people in the tower could be, and the chain will gain its link because the keeper considered the intermediate lighthouses part of the order. For 6 days, the column built the lighthouse on the watershed, and for all 6 days, the gray sea below learned to fight. The fog sent tongues spilling down the slope, and those tongues probed the edge of the light. The beast came every night and howled. On the 4th night, it brought a second one. By the 5th, there were 4 of them, and the 4 of them howled from all 4 sides, so that the horses lay down on the ground. The people worked with their ears plugged with wax, placing blocks with trembling hands. Mara walked along the edge of the light like a sentry, and her tainted hand pointed out the tongues of fog before the lookouts could see them. She hardly slept, and Aiden saw that the gray roots on her arm had crept up to her elbow, despite the light. The corruption within her was learning from the fog outside. On the 6th evening, Aden placed his palm on the base of the lighthouse. The bowl flared to life. The dome unfolded from the ridge down the slope like a white wing, and the gray sea receded for the first time in a month. The mist parted from the road, revealing the wet cobblestones, the submerged roadside shrine, and the first bridge. Something else was revealed as well. Along the entire road, creatures stood in the settling mist, hundreds of them. They stood shoulder to shoulder, facing the dome, and did not attack. They were waiting for an order. And then a wave swept across the gray sea from the horizon like a boulder thrown into a pond, and all those hundreds of heads turned westward at once. Mara fell to her knees. Aiden caught her, and she clung to him with her crippled hand, with a strength she could not possibly have possessed. Her eyes were momentarily clouded with gray, and a strange, even voice spoke 4 words through her lips. "You bring me light." Then the gray receded, and Mara slumped in her brother's arms, breathing as if she'd just run. The creatures below turned and streamed westward along with the retreating horde, leaving the road empty all the way to the tower. The sleeper was recalling his army, and that was more terrifying than an assault. He wasn't defending himself. He was inviting them. The light bearers reached the Veld Tower at dawn without a single skirmish. On the upper platform, by a smoldering fire, they found 11 survivors. 10 were people, emaciated to the point of transparency. The 11th was a tall man in a traveling cloak with an unfamiliar bearing and a calm face. And when Aiden raised a lantern to examine him, something happened that had never happened before. The white light fell on the stranger and revealed nothing. Neither human flesh, nor a gray body, nor a red dot. The light flowed around him like water flows around glass. The man smiled calmly and politely at this. He said his name was Siren. He said he had been walking from the east along the same road as they were only a month earlier and had been stranded in Veld when the city sank. He picked up his travel bag, opened it, and Aiden's breath caught in his throat. Inside the bag lay a kerosene lantern, a copper body of the same cast, a solid rim without a single seam, cold glass. Siren said he'd found it in a dead city to the south, and that the lantern wouldn't light in his hands, but he believed there was someone out there who could light it. He held out the lantern to Aiden, handle first, and asked him to try. Behind Aiden's back, Mara slowly reached behind her belt for her knife. Her cursed hand stared at Siren, and for the first time during the entire journey, she remained silent. Her hand sensed neither mist nor human nor beast within him. It sensed nothing at all, as if there were a human-shaped hole in the tower before them, and from below on the road, people were already shouting and calling for the carrier because the sentries had spotted, in the mist receding to the west, what lay beyond the thick fog. Far away in the gray haze, above the invisible horizon, a glow was rising even, unblinking, and green. Siren stood on the tower platform with his lantern outstretched, waiting for a response, while Aiden was in no hurry to take the stranger's copper. He looked at the man whom the light did not reveal and pieced together in his mind the words of the dead Coven. "Do not trust anyone who emerges from the fog with a green light." Siren's lantern was not green. Siren's lantern was colorless, and that was even more frightening. Aiden said he would try to light the stranger's fire, but not here, down below, under the lighthouse dome, in full view of everyone. Siren agreed immediately and without hesitation, and that ease also tipped the scales. They descended in silence. The 10 rescued Velders wept and kissed the wet cobblestones of the road, while Siren walked among them with the steady stride of a man who had been in no hurry for a very long time. The entire column had gathered beneath the dome at the crest. Aiden took the cold lantern in his left hand, holding his own in the right. The stranger's copper did not warm up. The wick did not flicker. Aiden held it for 100 heartbeats and nothing happened. Siren watched this without disappointment. He said that meant the bearer of this fire had not yet been born or had already died. He asked permission to go west with the column because a lone traveler could not survive in these lands. Brant took Aiden aside and said quietly that a man without a reflection in the light is a knife without a hilt. and he could not be taken along in the convoy. Mara said the opposite. She said it was better to keep a human-shaped hole in front of one's eyes than behind one's back. Aiden decided as Mara had decided. Siren was assigned a spot on the last wagon, and 2 stonemasons were assigned to him under the guise of fellow travelers. Garth volunteered to be the 3rd. The column set off northwest toward the 6th marker, and for the first time on the journey, Aden looked back at the work of his hands. The view from the ridge stretched far into the distance. To the east, a white glow hung over Ashford. Beyond it, the light of Solvern could be made out. Even farther away, at the edge of his vision, Grey Hall glowed, 4 white lights in a row and a 5th overhead. The chain existed. It was short and thin, but it already cut through the darkness in the east from one end to the other. And in the west, in response, stood a steady green glow that did not flicker. The 6th landmark was Holmgard, a fortress on a cliff by a mountain pass which, according to Brandt, would not fall even to a human army. It was 5 days' march away, and those 5 days taught the column a new kind of war. The fog no longer attacked in droves. The fog hunted. On the 2nd day, a sentry who had gone to fetch water 30 paces from the column disappeared. Only his canteen was found. On the 3rd night, the hounds of the sleeper howled for the first time, not from outside the light, but from within his head. People woke up to a howl that wasn't there and reached for their weapons. Mara taught the column a simple remedy. She ordered everyone to speak aloud their name and their 3 most cherished memories to their neighbor by the campfire each night. The fog enters where memory is silent. A memory spoken aloud lasts longer. The nights began to resemble a strange prayer. 200 people spoke in hushed tones to one another about the first snow, about their mother's hands, about the taste of bread, and the howling gave the camp a wide berth. Siren did not take part in these conversations. The stonecutters reported that their traveling companion was polite, quiet, and slept without dreams. Garth reported something else. Garth noticed that Siren never ate in front of others, and that at night during the 3rd rest stop, he stood facing west for an hour, his lips moving. On the 5th day, the column reached the mountain pass and came to a halt as if facing a wall. Holmgard stood in place. The rock stood, the walls stood, but the fortress was silent. No fire in the towers, no smoke above the roofs, no voices from the walls. The gates stood wide open and fog filled the gateway. Not a gray sea, but a neat mist lying exactly along the edge of the walls, as if the fortress had been filled with mist like a mug. Brandt said that Holmgard had held this pass for 300 years and that there was no other way across the ridge. Mara listened to her hand for a long time and said something strange. It's quiet inside. Not empty, but specifically quiet. As quiet as it is when everyone is asleep. Aiden led 3 light bearers and 40 volunteers inside. Light poured through the gate, and the mist retreated down the street exactly 50 paces, revealing what had caused the people to lose heart. The inhabitants of Holmgard were here, all of them. They stood along the streets, sat on doorsteps, lay in beds visible through open windows, alive, warm, breathing, and asleep. Hundreds of sleeping people with calm, peaceful faces, and beneath each one's skin in the white light, a thin gray pattern was visible, like frost on glass. The fog hadn't devoured the fortress. The fog had lulled it to sleep and held it like a storeroom. Rome shook the young guard at the gate by the shoulders, and the guard breathed and smiled in his sleep, but didn't wake up. Mara tried her own method. She leaned close to the sleeping woman's ear and began naming her possessions. Your home, your ring, your child. There he is, sleeping right beside you. The woman frowned in her sleep, and the gray frost beneath her skin stirred. But the dream would not let her go. They had to call on memory by name, but the strangers did not know those names. And then Siren spoke. He had been the last to enter the fortress without permission. He stood over the sleeping old man and looked at him the way one looks at a familiar book. He said the old man's name was Ved, and that he had spent 40 years repairing the gates of this fortress. He walked over to the sleeping girl and said her name was Leah and that she was afraid of thunderstorms but loved watching the lightning from under the stairs. He walked down the street, naming the names and habits of hundreds of people whom, according to him, he had never met. Aiden blocked his path and asked him point blank where he was from. For the first time in all those days, Siren fell silent for a long time. Then he said quietly that he didn't know. He said that names simply lay within him, just as stones lie at the bottom of a river, and that there were many such stones within him and more foreign ones among them than his own. He said he didn't remember his face before Veld and asked not to be questioned further, because beyond that, he remembered nothing. There was no time to choose. The mist at the edges of the world was already testing the boundary, and those sleeping closer to it were beginning to frown as if in a bad dream. Aiden laid out the plan. Siren walks down the street under guard, calling out names. Mara and 10 volunteers with the clearest voices follow behind, calling the sleepers by name and restoring to them their belongings, their homes, and their loved ones. The lantern's light holds back the mist and burns away the gray frost. Thus began the strangest battle of the campaign, a battle fought in whispers. The first to wake was the blacksmith, to whom the name of his hammer had been restored. He sat up and cried out, and his cry roused 3 neighbors faster than any words could. Those who had awakened roused their own, and they knew names that none of the newcomers knew. Awakening swept through the fortress like a wave from the gates to the citadel, like fire through dry grass. The mist retreated before this wave because the awakened memory burned it just as fiercely as light. By sunset, Homeguard was screaming, weeping, and calling out to his people in every street at once, while the mist retreated into the citadel like a beast into its lair. Within the citadel lay the heart of this silence. Seated on the throne in the main hall was a creature unlike any that had come before. A slender gray figure with 100 long fingers, each finger extending like a thread into the walls, into the floor, into the city, and into the backs of the heads of those still asleep. The spinner, that was what Mara called her. The creature did not fight. The creature hurriedly finished weaving its web, trying to lull those who had awakened back to sleep, and in the white light one could see how the threads stretched toward people's heads and snapped against their screams. The spinner's red dot was located where people's throats. Aiden didn't make it in time. The Homeguard blacksmith was the quickest. He had been walking across the hall with his hammer, hearing no one's commands because one of the threads had been stealing his daughter's dreams all winter. The hammer came down on the gray throat, and the spinner was torn apart along with her entire web. The last sleepers opened their eyes in a single collective sigh. The lantern in Aden's hand flared up. The 6th division settled on the rim next to the 5th, which had been formed at the watershed. The radius grew to 80 paces. The dome rose above the cliff, and the mountain pass and Homeguard blazed with the 6th white fire in the chain. That night, the fortress feasted on whatever provisions they could find, while Aiden stood on the wall with Brant and gazed westward. The green glow beyond the ridge grew closer and higher. Brant said that beyond the ridge lay the plains of Midra, and that the 7th mark was the city of Argent, the silver mines. He also explained why he had come to the wall without wine. His men had taken stock of their supplies. With all the overseer's caches combined, there was enough kerosene for 4 weeks' travel, but there were still 6 divisions missing from the rim. The chain was consuming oil faster than the ground could produce it, and while they were counting the shortfall, shouts rang out from below in the courtyard. It was Garth shouting. Aiden scrambled down from the wall and found him by the last wagon. Garth was clutching his face, blood trickling between his fingers, and 2 stonemasons lay motionless. Siren's wagon was empty. Garth spat out 3 words along with his blood. He went to wake them. Aiden didn't understand, so Garth repeated himself, pointing toward the citadel with his battered face. Siren had spent the entire evening questioning the Hulm Guardians about their dreams, and then he said he understood where his own name lay. It lies to the west, sleeping among the other stones, and whoever reclaims his name from the very source will awaken as his true self. He walked alone through the small gate into the lightless fog, and the sentry at the gate swears that the mist parted before him as if he were one of its own. Aiden forbade any pursuit of Saren from the very first moment, and that prohibition weighed on him more heavily than any battle. Night, fog beyond the dome, a man whom the light cannot see, and before whom the mist parts. Anyone sent after him would simply be devoured by the darkness. Aiden stood by the small gate, gazing into the blackness and acknowledging aloud what was burning within him. He himself had led a man-shaped void through 3 settlements, and the void listened, counted, and remembered everything. Names, roads, dome calculations, kerosene shortages. Now all of this was heading west faster than the convoy. Mara spoke up about this unexpected turn of events. She said she wasn't sure that Siren was a spy. Her hand had remained silent about him the whole way, and the mist remains silent only about what does not belong to the mist. She said that perhaps a third thing had gone west, neither light nor mist, and it's unclear which of the two is worse. In the morning, Holmgar did what all those rescued before him had done. He gave. The fortress opened its military storerooms, 300 years deep, and in those storerooms they found something neither the villages nor the merchants possessed: mountain oil, a thick black sludge that the people of Holmgard had collected for centuries in the caves of the and burned in siege cauldrons. Rome poured it into the lighthouse's lamp bowl, and the bowl accepted it as if it were its own. The flame from the mountain oil burned lower, but lasted 3 times longer than that of kerosene. The shortage went from life-threatening to merely severe. The fortress also provided guides across the mountain range and 50 mountain riflemen, led by that very blacksmith named Bran, who, after the spinner, looked up to Aiden as an older brother. The journey across the range took 4 days. The pass greeted the column, not with fog, but with cold, and in the cold, a new property of the light became apparent. Within the circle of the lantern's light, the snow did not melt but ceased to burn. The people spent the night in snowdrifts at the edge of the light, as if by a stove. On the 3rd day of their journey, they found tracks at the pass. A trail of human footprints led westward, right along the edge of the precipice, a place even a goat would not dare to cross. The stride of the tracks was as even as if they were on a flat surface. Bran measured them and said that no human walks like that. The tracks belonged to a siren, and they were 2 days ahead of the column. From the pass, the plains of Midra lay spread out before them, and the column came to a silent halt. The plains were striped. Wide, gray rivers of fog flowed through the lowlands, skirting the hills, and at the junctions between them, settlements were ablaze. Not with white or green light, but with the ordinary red glow of fires. Midra was still fighting for itself. And to the southwest, above the plain, stood a pillar of green light piercing the clouds, and Brant recognized the 7th marker beneath it. Argent, the silver city, burned green like the Eshford Tower, only 1,000 times more intensely. They had descended over the course of the day, and on the plain, for the first time, the column encountered not beasts, but people with weapons. A mounted patrol of 30 sabers blocked the road and demanded they identify themselves. They were Midra soldiers from the surviving garrison of the town of Rast. Their centurion, named Corvus, heard the word light and laughed a wicked laugh. He said they had already seen the light. He said that a month ago, recruiters from Argenta had traveled across the entire plain carrying green lamps and news of a miraculous salvation. 3 villages had gone under the green light voluntarily, their entire populations, including children and livestock. No one had returned, but every week letters arrived from Argenta to their families, written in familiar handwriting, describing how good life was there. Corvus said that if the guests had brought yet another magical fire, they should pack it up while they were still in one piece. Aiden didn't argue out loud. He asked the centurion to give him the most skeptical soldier and an hour's time. Corvus offered himself. The hour turned into an evening. Aiden led the centurion along the edge of the light, showed him the red spots on the hound's carcass that Branna's archers had dragged in, demonstrated how the curse on the volunteer's arm receded from the white flame, and pointed out the overseer's map and the chain of lights to the east, visible to the naked eye from the plain. Corvus remained silent all the evening and at the end said only one thing. The green light never revealed anything. The green light only made promises. In the morning, Rasta's garrison of 200 swordsmen formed a column, and the column set out for Argent as a small army. Along the way, Corvus told them what he knew about the city. Argent stands above the mines, and the mines are a labyrinth of 100 versts of passages. A month ago, a prophet appeared in the city whom no one had ever seen face to face. He speaks to the city through the chosen ones, and his voice is passed from mouth to mouth. He calls himself the Awakened One, and teaches that the fog is the god's dream, and the green light is his mercy. Aiden listened, and a steady, deep chill settled within him. He asked when exactly the prophet had appeared. Corvus counted on his fingers. It turned out to be the day after the night when Siren left Holmgard. 2 days' worth of tracks had a month earlier turned into a fully built city, so either there was more than one Siren, or time flowed differently in the west, or the one who had gone in search of a name had found not a name. They approached Argent at dawn, but dawn had not yet broken. A green dome, mimicking the white ones, hung over the city and a verst around it, and beneath the dome was the pale green light of a dead pharmacy. The gates stood open. A column of people was waiting at the gates. Thousands of people were lined up along the main street from the gates to the mining square in even rows, and they were silent. Each held a small green lamp in their hands. Their faces were calm, content, and weathered, like Garth's mother's on the Eshford platform. Corvus's people recognized their own in the ranks. Someone shouted a sister's name, and the sister turned her head, smiled, and did not answer. Aiden rode through the gate on the lead light bearer, with a lantern held aloft, and white light fell upon the ranks. He expected to see the gray frost of sleep or a pattern of corruption. He saw the worst. Beneath the skin of everyone standing in the white light, a thin green thread was visible. A single thread entered the back of the neck and disappeared underground. Not a web spun by a 100-fingered spinner, a single shared vein for the entire city, leading into the mines. All of Argent was connected to a single route, and that route awaited guests below. In the mine square, a single person without a lamp met the procession, a woman dressed as a mining foreman with a bright, lively face. In the white light, she was simply a human being without threads or patterns. She introduced herself as Vesta, the senior master of the mines. She said there were 17 like her left in the city. The Awakened One does not touch those needed for the dewatering machines because if the pumps stop, the mines will flood. She said that for a month, the 17 masters had been pretending to have converted and waiting for at least something from the east. And she said they had to go down today because tonight was a festival. The Awakened One had announced that tonight the city would become one and all the threads would weave together into a single one. After that, Vesta said there would be no one left to wake. The council was brief and terrifying. Brant remained above with half the forces to hold the square with the light bearers and the ranks of townspeople sleeping while awake. Going down were Aiden with Mara's lantern, Bran with 20 archers, Corvus with 20 swordsmen, and Vesta as their guide. Rome stayed behind to assemble the lighthouse from the blocks that had been brought because the partition and the dome were needed by the city by dawn, regardless of the outcome. The descent began at noon, but there was no such thing as half a day underground. The mines greeted them with darkness, in which the white circle of the lantern seemed like the world's last coin. Vesta led the way down the main tunnel along a green vein that grew thicker with each level. On the third level, the vein became as thick as an arm and began to glow on its own. On the fifth level, fireless lamps lined the walls, empty green glass set into the rock. On the seventh level, Mara stopped and said that beyond this point, her hand could hear nothing. Nothing at all. Just like back then on the Veld Tower. They were walking deeper into a man-shaped hole. The tunnel ended at the gates of an old mine shaft, and beyond the gates lay a chamber that had never been carved by human hands. A circular cavity the size of a temple hollowed out of a silver vein. The walls of the hall were mirror-like with metal, and they reflected 1,000 times the figure standing in the center, Siren. He stood within a ring of green fire burning directly from the stone, and he had changed. His traveling cloak had crumbled away. The body beneath it had become translucent, and within it, faces swam slowly like fish in the depths of water. Hundreds of faces. Among them, Aden recognized the old man, Ved, and the girl Leah from Holmgard. He recognized the 2 sentinels who had gone missing on the plain. He recognized faces he did not know, but which knew him and turned toward him from within a stranger's body. Siren looked at those who had entered with both his own eyes and the eyes of others at once, and his voice was 2-layered, like an echo. He said he was glad that Aden had made it. He said that in the West he had found not a name, but the truth, and that the truth was simple. The sleeper does not give birth to the mist. The sleeper is the mist, and the mist is all of them. Everyone who is devoured does not disappear, but flows into... The sleeper is the chorus of all the forgotten, and the chorus grows and calls to the rest, because it is cold to be alone in memory, but warm together. He said that he himself is the answer to the riddle. He is what happens when the devoured refuses to dissolve. A clump of someone else's memory that crawled out of the sleeper and forgot the way back. Light does not see him, because he is the very stuff of which the reverse side of light is made. And he spoke his final words, raising his hand above the green ring. Tonight he will return to the chorus, not as a captive, but as a heart. He will bring the sleeper an entire city of willing voices, and the choir will finally grow loud enough to sing the lullaby to the end. Until the end of the world. And then he lowered his hand, and the green vein beneath his feet flared along its entire length from the hall to the back of every head above, and from above, through 100 fathoms of stone, came the collective sigh of the city as it drifted into its final sleep. Bran hurled the hammer before anyone had time to think. The hammer passed through the siren as though through water, piercing the mirrored wall behind it, and the faces within the translucent body did not even flinch. Corvus ordered the blades to strike, and the blades sank into the siren without leaving a mark. There was no red dot inside it because there was no body inside. Aiden turned the lantern up to full brightness, and for the first time the white light caused the siren pain. It wasn't the light that was in pain, but the faces inside. The devoured turned toward the white fire, reaching for it from within, like drowning people reaching for a hole in the ice, and for the first time, the siren stopped smiling. He took a step back. Aiden understood and shouted out what he had realized. The siren cannot be killed. The siren can only be taken apart. Every face inside is a stolen memory, and a memory can be called out just as they called out to the sleepers in Holmgard. Mara was already shouting the first name. She was shouting the name of the sentry Tyvar who had gone missing on the plain. She was shouting that she had his flask, that his horse was waiting up above, that his sister in Rasta was alive. Tyvar's face inside the siren turned toward the voice, surged toward the surface, and burst forth. A clump of warm light shot out of its translucent chest, flew across the hall, and melted into sparks. The siren swayed and became a hair's breadth denser and a hair's breadth smaller, 1 out of hundreds. There was no time, because the city was being buried upstairs, but there was no choice, either. Aiden had set up the battle this way. Bran's arrows and Corvus's blades held the green ring, preventing the siren from stepping toward the vein. Vesta calls out names. She is the senior master. She has been taking shifts for 30 years and knows half of Argenta by name. And the faces of the Argentans are in Siren because recruiters have been bringing people here for a month, Mara calls out the Home Guardians. Aden holds the light. The siege of a man has begun. Vesta stood in the white circle and called out. She called out to Odd, the bolter, who ties the best knot on the entire 7th level. She called out to Selma, the backcaller, who sings in the mind so loudly it can be heard across the level. She called out the names, shift after shift, year after year, and for every third name, a pale mass flew out of Siren. Siren resisted. He spoke in voices. He answered Vesta in the voice of her husband, who had perished in a cave-in, and Vesta faltered mid-word, and Mara took up the call while the foreman swallowed her tears. He shouted in the voice of Bran's mother, and Bran turned pale, but did not budge. He offered Corvus the return of his 3 soldiers alive, and Corvus replied that dead soldiers needed not life but freedom, and called out their names, his own voice breaking. The siren was shrinking. With every face that emerged, he lost height, density, and confidence. And the faces inside him were no longer floating, but pushing themselves to the surface. The prison realized there was a door. And then the siren made his final move. He stopped defending himself, straightened up, and stepped not toward the vein, but toward Aiden. He said very quietly, in a voice that was now almost a single tone, that what remained within him was what Aiden would want to preserve. He opened his chest as one opens a gate, and deep within, among the last unfamiliar faces, Aiden saw a face he would have recognized even if he were blind. An older man with narrowed eyes and scorched eyebrows, Olem Tarn, the keeper. The old man did not die a natural death in Greyhall. The old man was devoured, and what was devoured reached the sleeper, and a part of him became lodged in Siren, just as all dissenters were lodged. Siren said that if Aiden were to dissect him to the very end, the keeper would melt into sparks like the rest, and along with him, the answers would melt away. How the rim is constructed, what lies behind the 12th division, why the sleeper calls the light to himself, rather than fleeing from it. Siren proposed a trade. He would leave for the mines forever, taking the last 24 faces and the keeper with them, and in exchange, he would give Aiden one answer of his choice. The hall fell silent. Vesta fell silent. Mara looked at her brother, and her mangled hand clenched into a fist. Aden looked at the old man's face inside the creature, and the old man inside looked back at him. Then the overseer's lips moved, and Aiden read 3 words from them, which the old man repeated twice. "Don't extinguish the fire." It was the last line of the note from the house by the palisade, and it was an order. Aiden raised the lantern and, instead of making a bid, called out a name. He was calling Olem Tarn, the lighthouse keeper, the man who had walked into the fog for 40 years in search of others' lives, who had left caches on every road, who had chosen a penniless cart driver as his heir and had not been mistaken. He told the old man that the chain was burning, 7 lights from Greyhall to this hall. He said that Mara was alive, that Greyhall still stood, that the map worked, and that the keeper's lighthouse was being assembled right now above their heads. The old man's face lunged inward toward the white light, and the siren screamed with 24 voices at once, because along with the keeper, all the others rushed toward the door. The translucent body burst without a sound. 24 pale clumps flew out in a swarm, passed through the hall, and melted away, while the last one lingered for a moment against Aiden's face. The warmth touched his forehead like a palm. Then sparks, then what had been beneath Siren all this time, remained lying on the stone floor, a kerosene lantern, that very same cold one without any markings, and its wick was burning. A tiny white flame stood steady in the unfamiliar glass, and Aiden realized, too late, that his legs buckled beneath him. The lantern wasn't dead. The lantern had been waiting for a bearer, and the bearer had been carrying it in his bag all this month without knowing that it was, in fact, both the lock and the key. Siren, a mass of rejected memory, was a failed bearer. The light did not see him, because light cannot see itself. Mara picked up the second lantern, and it did not go out in her hand. The tainted hand held the white flame, and the gray roots on it receded faster in this light than they had from Aiden's lantern. The second fire chose itself. There was no time to think it through. The green vein in the floor of the hall trembled and rocked the city to sleep, and now it had no master, but had gathered momentum. Vesta shouted that the vein was fed not by the mines, but by what lay deeper than the mines, and that it had to be cut at the root, or else the city would not wake up. The root was lower down. Everyone descended after the vein to the last flooded level, where Vesta's pumps had kept the water at bay for a month, and there, waist deep in black water, they found it. The vein led into a round well formed by a natural sinkhole. And from the sinkhole came not cold, but silence, the very same silence of Veld and Holmgard, a direct passage into the misty depths of the world. The sleeper hadn't sent a route into Argent. The sleeper had reached this far with his own body. There was nothing to cut the sleeper himself with, but the vein at the edge of the sinkhole was being bathed in white light. Aiden and Mara stood over the well with 2 lanterns and merged the 2 circles of light into one. Where the circles overlapped to the light became not twice but 10 times denser. The white spot where they met fell upon the green vein, and the vein began to smoke. It resisted for an hour. It thickened and thinned, trying to retreat deep into the rock, and from below, from the well, sigh after sigh rose toward the light like the breath of someone having a bad dream. As the hour drew to a close, the vein burst and was sucked into the chasm like a severed fishing line. And at that very moment, from above, through 100 sajins of rock, came a sound that Auden would remember for the rest of his life. The city awoke with a scream. Thousands of people above opened their eyes at once, and with them, the walls trembled across all the levels. They rose upward as if surfacing. At the exit of the tunnel, they were met by a dawn that Argent hadn't seen in a month. The green dome went dark. Rome stood by the completed lighthouse, black with dust, waiting only for the bearer's palm. Aiden and Mara placed both palms on the base at once, and the bowl caught fire from the 2 lanterns. The 8th division flared up on Aiden's side, and on Mara's side. The first one lit up on her clean rim, and her dome lay over her brother's dome in a double layer. Aiden's radius of light became 120 paces, and the number no longer held its former meaning because there were now 2 lights in the chain, and the chain was capable of overlapping itself. The people of Argena knelt not before the bearers, but before one another. People who had walked for a month carrying lamps embraced those they had once led in formation, and asked for forgiveness for things they did not remember. Vesta found all 17 of her masters alive in the crowd. Corvus found his soldier's sister but could not find the other 3, and stood over the city's roster with dry eyes. Brant was the only one who did not celebrate. He climbed up to the bearers on the lighthouse platform with a spyglass and silently handed it to Aiden, pointing to the southwest. Aiden looked. Beyond the plain, where the overseer's map marked the 9th point near the city of Liston, there was no green glow. There was no glow at all. Above the 9th marker in the morning sky stood something that made the telescope waver in his hand. A pillar of fog arising from the ground to the clouds spun slowly and silently like a spindle, and it was creeping forward. Vesta peered through the telescope and said a single word that Aiden didn't know, Coden. She said that the elders had told stories about such things. When the fog stops waiting, it rises and walks on its own. The sleeper was lost. Argent was lost. Siren was lost. It had lost its lifeblood and ceased to beckon. The spindle moved across the plain toward the east, straight toward the chain. The wandering one moved at the speed of a marching column and did not veer off course. Corvus's patrols had led him across the plain for 3 days, always bringing back the same news. The spindle moves along a straight line, drawn as if with a ruler from the 9th marker on Argent. From Argent, this line continues toward Holmgard to the pass, and onward along the entire chain to Ziraikal. The sleeper no longer hunted people. The sleeper moved to extinguish the beacons in the reverse order in which they had been lit. Everything the spindle passed through ceased to exist. The patrol brought back a sack of soil from its path, and the soil was gray, rootless, wormless, and odorless. Behind the spindle lay a strip a verst wide where even the soil had lost its memory. The military council in Argente lasted all night and split down the middle. Corvus and Bran argued for meeting the spindle in the field with all the light bearers and both lanterns. Vesta and Brant argued for holding it back with the city's walls and dome. Rome remained silent, did the math, and by morning shot down both plans with 2 figures. The spindle's height reached the clouds while Argenta's dome stood 300 cubits high. The spindle will not break through the dome. The spindle will straddle it from above and flood the city from above like a bucket in a river. And out in the field, both lanterns cast a shadow 30 paces wide, and the spindle, a quarter versed thick, will simply bypass the shadow without noticing it. You can't burn something like that with light. The answer didn't come from the military or the craftsman. The answer came from Mara. She had sat all night poring over the overseer's second map with a lantern. And at dawn, she called everyone to the table. She reminded them that the green lines on the map were the arcs of the domes, calculated to meet at their edges. She asked Rome what would happen at the point where not 2 domes, but 3. Rome took a piece of coal, made his calculations, and his hand stopped. At the point of triple overlap, according to the watchman's calculations, the light would rise not as a spot, but as a pillar. The pillar stretching the full height of the domes up to the sky. The old man had calculated the chain not as a fence. The old man had calculated the chain as a trap, and the map marked the point where the trap could be sprung. Between Argent Holmgard and the intermediate watershed beacon lay the Cause Valley, through which a straight path ran exactly down the middle. If a 9th beacon were placed in the valley, then the moment it was lit, the 3 domes would close over the valley, and along the line of their triple seam, a wall of light would rise from the ground to the clouds across the spindle's path. The plan was sound on paper and insane in reality. It takes 6 days to build a lighthouse. The procession will be in the valley in 4 days. That means they'll have to build it while the procession is there. That meant, for the last 2 days of construction, the spindle would stand over the valley and watch the builders from above, and that meant the bearers would light the lighthouse at the very moment when the very cause of the fog would come to extinguish their lights. Argent went out into the Cause Valley with everything he had. 1,000 hands, 100 carts of stone that had been aged in the light during a month of green captivity, and was therefore especially eager for white fire.
Vesta's pumps, modified to pump mountain oil.
The column marched and sang because Corvus had told his men that a silent army had already lost. They built as no one else ever builds. Mara stood with her lantern at the northern edge of the site, Aiden at the southern edge, and in that double light, the stone set in hours instead of days. Rome did not sleep at all, and his blueprints were carried behind him like a banner. On the 3rd day, the tower had risen to half its height, and on the 3rd day, the Hodani arrived. He entered the valley from the west at noon, and the world was plunged into twilight. The spindle blocked out the sun. Up close, it turned out not to be smooth. Across its rotating mass, gigantic shadows of faces rose and sank, as in the body of a siren, only each face was the size of a hill. The choir of the sleeper gazed at the construction site with thousands of eyes, and at that gaze, people dropped their tools. And then the walker began to sing, not with the howl of hounds, but with a lullaby. A quiet, simple lullaby that everyone in the valley recognized because every mother had sung it to them. The song didn't enter their ears, but seeped beneath them. The first to lie down was the mason's apprentice, a 14-year-old boy. He simply sat down by the masonry, smiled, and fell asleep with a gray frost beneath his skin. 2 cart drivers lay down after him. The song did from a verse away what a spinner did with a touch. Aiden darted along the scaffolding with a light, but the light roused the bodies, and the song immediately rocked them back to sleep. The construction site was dying not from a blow, but from tenderness. Vesta found salvation, and it was as simple as a hammer. She ordered them to strike the iron.
All the cauldrons, all the hammers, all the sheets of copper were hoisted onto the scaffolding, and 1,000 hands began to work amid the unceasing thunder of iron, taking turns at the clanging like pumps. The roar did not drown out the lullaby. The roar served as a reminder. Every blow told the body that it was on a construction site, not in a cradle.
For 2 days, the Coast Valley thundered so loudly that the Holmgard sentries beyond the ridge could hear the clanging. People laid stone with cotton wool in their ears, blood streaming from their noses from the sheer volume of the noise, and the tower rose in the shadow of the spindle, which stood half a verst away and watching. It did not attack. Aiden understood why, and the realization sent a chill down his spine. Hor did not want to destroy the unfinished lighthouse. Hor was waiting for fire. The sleeper needed not stone, but light at the moment of birth. To extinguish the flame, the very second it appeared, meant something Aden did not know, but it would have been enough for the old man to warn him. Do not extinguish the flame. On the 6th morning, the tower stood ready, and the bowl awaited oil. The spindle stood above the western edge of the valley, 400 paces from the lighthouse, and its rotation had accelerated. The lullaby fell silent. Complete silence fell over the valley, and in that silence, Aden and Mara walked toward the base of the tower across an empty plaza lit by 2 lanterns. People watched from the slopes. Rome asked to be the only one to light the fire because the seam calculation might have an error, and an error would burn the one who lit it. The bearers silently refused. Aiden's hand rested on the stone first. Mara's hand followed. The bowl caught fire, and in the next heartbeat, everything happened at once. The 3 domes closed together, 3 bright arcs converged across the sky from Argent, from Holmgard, and from the new tower, and where they met above the valley, the seam formed. A wall of white light, a palm's width wide and reaching up to the clouds, stretched across the valley from south to north, humming like a string. And the spindle leaped. It moved swiftly and skillfully. Its entire spinning mass surged forward toward the tower to extinguish the fire the very instant it was born, and with its full mass it struck the seam. There was no sound. There was light. For a moment, the Kos Valley turned white on the inside like milk, and when their vision returned, the people on the slopes saw what they would later tell their grandchildren. The spindle hung there, split in 2. A wall of light had passed through it like wire through clay, and both halves slowly settled on either side of the seam, losing their rotation. Gigantic faces rose from the depths toward the cleft, and where they touched the light, they did not burn. They separated. Luminous clumps the size of a house emerged from the gray depths in swarms, rose upward along the wall of light, and melted into the morning sky like flocks of birds. The chorus was losing its voices by the thousands. The Hoden was dying, not like a beast, but like a hand letting go. By noon, all that remained of the spindle were 2 gray scree slopes on either side of the fissure. The scree seeped into the dead earth, and on that dead earth, for the first time, greenery sprouted where the Hoden had passed. The light of the seam returned to the strip what the spindle had gathered across the plain. The Kos Valley screamed louder than it thundered. Bran wept aloud, without shame. Corvus lined up his men and saluted the wall of light with their blades as they would a senior commander. Vesta sat on a rock and simply looked up toward where the swarms had gone. Aiden stood by the tower and looked at the rim. The 9th Division was ablaze. Mara's 2nd Division was ablaze, and his lantern revealed yet another thing that had not been there before. Inside the flame, right at the wick, a tiny shadow appeared. The shadow was shaped like a person sitting hunched over, and Aden stared at it for a long time before realizing what he was seeing. The light began to reveal to him a sleeping figure. After the 3 remaining divisions, the lantern was already reaching toward its enemy, just as a lamp lowered into a well reaches the bottom. The sleeper sat somewhere to the west, hunched over, and no longer looked enormous. That night, at the camp by the tower, Aiden called a council and announced his decision. The chain would proceed without him. The 10th and 11th markers would be taken by 2 wings. The northern wing would be led by Mara, with her lantern, Corvus, and the home guards. The southern wing would be led by Brant, Vesta, and Bran, setting up beacons according to Rome's calculations. As for himself, he would set out with a small detachment from the Kos Valley directly west toward the 12th marker, because after the night's march, he had realized the most important thing. The sleeper loses voices and grows weaker with every beacon, but the sleeper also learns with every beacon. The night march was the 2nd attempt. The choir's 3rd attempt will not be against the stone or against the light. The choir's 3rd attempt will be against the bearers, and one cannot wait for it in one place. The council argued until the third cock crow and gave in. In the morning, 2 wings and a small detachment set out from the tower along 3 roads, and Mara embraced her brother at the fork in the road the way people embrace when they're not sure they'll meet again. Her damaged hand had healed back to her wrist over the course of a month of light, but the gray roots at her wrist remained and did not fade. She whispered softly into his shoulder that her hand now hears the sleeper constantly, just as one hears the river behind a wall. And that tonight the river sounded different, neither with malice nor with song. The river sounded like anticipation. The sleeper in the west had stopped defending himself and begun to prepare for a guest. And an hour after they parted, a sentry from the small detachment picked up from a roadside rock what had been lying on it, right in the middle of the road to the west. A sheet of old oil-stained paper weighed down by a pebble. On the sheet, in the same handwriting used for the note found in the house by the palisade, were fresh lines of text. Olam Tarn wrote that if Aiden was reading this, it meant he had reached the 9th and was heading toward the last one. The old man wrote that he should have told the truth sooner, but hadn't dared. The 12th Division does not open the way to the sleeper. The 12th Division is the sleeper itself, and whoever lights the final fire will himself become what the first bearer once became, the one who holds all the mist within himself, so that the mist does not hold the world. The small squad passed the dead old man's letter around in a circle, and each one who read it then looked at Aiden in a special way. That's how people look at someone in whom they've found a fatal illness, yet he doesn't yet know how to live with it. The squad was small and elite: Garth, with a scar across his face, Finn with his bow, Rome with his blueprints, 10 Esford marksmen, and Vesta, who, in the final hour before departure, swapped places with one of the master craftsmen from the South Wing, saying that anyone could be taught to operate the pumps, but she alone knew how to read the Earth's inner workings. Garth asked aloud what everyone was thinking. Is this his real handwriting, or has the sleeper learned to write in someone else's hand, just as he used to write letters to his family from Argenta? Rome compared the sheet to the overseer's map and said the handwriting was the same, right down to the way the pen was pressed at the end of the lines. Vesta offered a third opinion. The letter lay exactly in the middle of the road, pressed down by pebbles on a night when only fog had passed along the road. So either the old man is alive, somewhere in the mist, or the part of the old man that left Cyrene in a swarm did not dissipate but flew westward and found a way to speak. Auden folded the sheet in 4, tucked it against his chest, and said that there was only one answer, and it lay ahead. The party set off westward, and the west began to change. For the first 2 days, they walked across a plain where, after the Hoodnik's demise, the fog lay in shreds like a routed army. The hounds howled from afar but did not approach. On the 3rd day, the road ended, not with a gap as before, but abruptly and terrifyingly. The path led up to a gray wall stretching from the earth to the sky, and this wall did not creep or breathe. It waited. Mara called such a thing the thickness, but this thickness was different. In the white light of the lantern, its edge did not recede, but only grew denser, like compressed lips. The only way to go further was inward. Aiden remembered the second map. The keeper had traveled this path and left caches, and the last cache was marked in a passageway inside the thickness at a spot labeled Shuttle. The squad tied themselves together with a rope, as one does on a glacier, stood within the circle of light, and stepped into the wall. Inside the thickness, there was neither ceiling nor sense of distance. The lantern's light reached 120 paces, but beyond the edge of the light, the gray darkness was so dense it seemed solid. Sounds died away after 3 paces. They followed Rome's compass, but after an hour the compass began to lie, spinning its needle in circles. Then Vesta took the lead. She walked first, holding her palm above the ground and reading the soil as she had read the rock in the mines. She said that real earth remembers water and roots, but dead, foggy earth remembers nothing and feels empty to the touch. The party walked along the border between the earth's memory and its forgetfulness, as if on a trail. By the end of the day's march, the light struck the shuttle, and everyone understood why the old man had chosen that word. In the midst of the mist stood a river barge. An entire dry barge 100 versts from any body of water embedded in the gray earth up to its waterline. The mist had once swept away the river along with the vessel, but the barge had not been forgotten because in its hold lay the caretaker's stash, lined with light-colored wood. Inside were barrels of mountain oil, hardtack, and a third map. There were no settlements on the third map. It showed a circle, a huge circle of 12 points, and 11 points along the arc coincided with the markers of the chain from Grey Hall to the south and north wings, while the 12th stood at the center of the circle. The keeper's chain had never been a road to the west. The chain was a ring around the center, and the ring was constructed so that at the hour when the last point, all the domes would close inwards. Rome ran his finger along the arcs, and his voice faltered. He said that with 11 beacons lit, the closing of the domes would bathe the entire circle in light, all the land inside the ring, except for a single point in the center where the seams would meet. The convergence point was marked with the same closed eye as on the first map. The sleeper did not sit behind the chain. The sleeper sat inside it at the very center, and the old man was luring not Aiden to the sleeper, but the sleeper into a castle of light that was meant to snap shut around him. They spent the night on the barge, and during the night, the mass made its third attempt, the one Aiden had warned the council about. It did not come as a howl or a lullaby. It came as a memory. Finn woke up to a voice and would have gone overboard if not for the rope, because beyond the edge of the light stood his mother, who had died 10 years ago, calling him to dinner. Garta was called by his brother's voice. Vesta was called by all 17 voices of her masters at once. The fog no longer stole memories. The fog returned them with interest and demanded payment. People clung to the rope as if it were the only truth, and Aiden walked along the rail with a lantern, illuminating the emptiness overboard so that everyone could see there was no one there. The light revealed the empty gray land, and the voices continued to call from the void, and that was worse than if there had been creatures standing there. By morning, all but Aiden had stopped calling. His voice had been waiting outside for the entire day's journey, and it was not his mother's voice, it was his own voice calling to him. Aiden heard himself from the mist. The voice walked beside him just beyond the edge of the light and spoke. It said it knew how the road would end, because it had already traveled it. It said that the 12th fire burns within a person, and that a person with that fire inside lives a long, very long life, longer than anyone they love. It listed those whom Aiden would outlive, and the list was correct. The group couldn't hear the voice. Aiden walked with clenched teeth, and during a rest stop, he honestly told his companions about the voice because a hidden lie deep within would be a hole in the rope. Vesta listened and asked simply, "The voice is telling the truth?" Aiden replied that it was most likely so. Vesta nodded and said that the truth was spoken to stop this weapon, and one does not take offense at a weapon. They continued on in silence, and on the second day of their journey deep within the depths, the light of the lantern began to reveal the bones of the world. Rising from the gray earth were things the mist had failed to consume. A bell tower down to its middle tier, a stone bridge spanning a vanished river, a garden of petrified trees with petrified apples, and everywhere on stone, on wood, on metal, signs had been scratched into the surface. A small lantern. The caretaker's mark was repeated hundreds of times, its edges worn away by time, and Rome was the first to realize it. The marks were decades old. The old man had walked this path more than once. The old man had walked here his whole life, marking the path for those who would follow, and the chain was the work of more than one generation. On the stone of the bridge, beneath the mark, there was a line carved into the stone older than the fresh inscription. The line said that the first bearer, named Ashka, had lit the fire and held back the fog with his own body 900 years ago, and that the fire must be passed on as long as the world endures. 900 years. The one sleeping in the center of the circle was not a monster from the abyss. The sleeper was a man who had sat with the mist inside him for 9 centuries and had grown weary. By evening on the second day, the mist ahead grew lighter. Not white, but Gray, it grew lighter the way water brightens near the surface, and the party emerged at a boundary no one had expected. The mist ended in a wall as smooth as the one they had passed through, and beyond the wall lay a valley without a single wisp of fog, a circular valley 10 versts across under a clear evening sky, grass, real, living grass up to their waists. A river divided the valley into an outer meadow and an island in the middle. On the island stood a hill. On the hill stood an old, roofless stone tower, and on the tower's top platform sat a hunched human figure, exactly as the lantern's light revealed it. And on this side of the river, in the outer meadow, stood houses. An entire village of 24 households, with vegetable gardens, smoke rising from chimneys, and laundry hanging on ropes, and people were already running from the village toward the detachment. Ordinary living people in old clothes, and they were running, not with weapons, but with cries of joy. An old man with a white beard was the first to reach them. He fell to his knees before Aiden, and Aiden saw his face, squinted eyes, scorched eyebrows. 20 years ago, that face had screamed in delirium to the entire village of Solvern about the green fire. Standing before him was the living Coven, the third bearer who had died in Solvern in front of witnesses 2 decades ago. Coven laughed, cried, touched Aiden's lantern as one might touch an icon, and spoke, swallowing his words quickly. He said, "Welcome to the heart." He said that all the bearers who had made it this far and those who hadn't lived here. He pointed at those running toward them and called out names that Aiden recognized from the markings and caches. He said that the sleeper hadn't devoured any of them. The sleeper had kept them by his side because the sleeper didn't need voices. He needed a successor. For 900 years, he has been waiting for someone who would agree to take his place on the tower, and none of them could bring themselves to agree, nor could they leave. And then Kovan stopped laughing, looked over Aiden's shoulder, and his face turned gray. Aiden turned around. Behind the detachment, the gray wall of the Earth's depth through which they had emerged was closing in. The passage was being drawn shut like water behind a ship's stern, and on the other side of the closing mist, the sound of iron clanging could be heard faintly, barely within earshot. Somewhere far to the east, the alarm rang out along the entire chain at once. Vesta turned pale and said what she had understood before anyone else, as she always understood the inner workings of the Earth. The mass of earth surrounding the valley is not a fortress wall. These are the walls of a well. The sleeper let the last bearer inside and sealed the entrance, and now he is drawing all the mist in the world here, pulling it from the plains, from the ridge, from the east toward this valley. He is gathering himself entirely in one place for the last time. Either everything will end here, or everything will begin anew from here. And the chain outside has been left without the one for whom it was built. The village of the bearers called their valley the heart, and one could not die in the heart. Aiden learned this on his very first evening, and the knowledge settled upon him colder than any mist. Kovan told his story at a table under the open sky by the light of 2 moons, and his tale was an inventory of a prison. 11 bearers lived in the valley. The oldest had come here 400 years ago and looked 60. Here, they did not age beyond the age at which they had arrived. Here, they did not fall ill. Wounds healed overnight. The river provided fish. The gardens yielded a harvest 4 times a year, and all of this was not a gift, but a payment. The sleeper kept his guests as one keeps spare wicks, dry, intact, and within reach. Each of the 11 had once arrived here with his own lantern and his own chain of lights on his back. Each climbed the tower. Each saw what sat on the top platform and heard the offer, and each said no. After the refusal, the lantern went out forever. The darkness outside devoured the abandoned chain in a matter of years, and the bearer remained to live in the valley because it was impossible to pass through the thickness without light, and the sleeper would not let him die. Kovan tried. Kovan spoke of this in the even voice of a man who had forgiven himself long ago. After saying no, he threw himself from the tower and woke up the next morning in the grass, unharmed. Then he walked into the depths without a flame, and the depths did not devour him but carried him back, just as a river carries a splinter. On the third attempt, the sleeper gave him a gift more terrifying than any punishment. It pushed Coven out into the world, but in payment took away all his memories of the valley and almost all the rest. Empty, Coven made his way to Solvern, died there in the eyes of men, and woke up again in the valley, in his own bed. The sleeper reclaimed his property, and from then on, Coven never tried again. Aiden listened and looked across the river at the tower. The hunched figure on the platform did not move. Finn asked about food, about winter, and about why none of the 11, over so many centuries, had ever conspired to take the tower by force. A woman named Erna, the seventh bearer, with the face of a 40-year-old and eyes as ancient as the tower's masonry, answered. She said they had tried that too. 100 years ago, 4 bearers swam across the river with axes. The river let them pass, the island let them pass, and the staircase let them pass. And on the top landing, they saw what everyone who climbs sees, and the axes were left lying by the last step. They still lie there to this day. Irene said that you cannot kill the sleeper, not because he is strong. You cannot kill him because whoever kills him will receive everything he holds. 500 years of fog will pour into the world through a hole the size of a single dead old man. That night, Aiden didn't sleep. He counted. The chain outside remained with 10 lights and 2 wings. They're now placing the 11th and 12th, according to the old map, not knowing that the 12th point is a trap of meaning. Mara is outside with the second lantern. The thickness around the valley grows with every hour because the sleeper is pulling himself into a ring, and when he has pulled himself completely in, then, according to Vesta's word, it will be either the end or a new beginning. And there was also the caretaker's calculation, the ring of domes closing in on itself at 11 lights. The old man wasn't building a road for the replacement. The old man was building a cage for the sleeper so that the replacement could speak to him as an equal. In the morning, Auden did what none of the 11 had done on the first day. He didn't go to the tower. He walked along the river through the outer meadow with a lantern and Vesta and began to search for what the watchman would have sought, the bottom. Vesta read the earth with her palm and found it by noon. Beneath the grass of the outer meadow lay a stone bearing markings older than any of the other marks. A circle of 12 notches, with rays radiating outward from the circle, exactly like the drawing on the third map, only carved centuries before the keeper's time. Someone, long before Olam Tarn, had known about the ring, and Vesta, having dug up the edge of the slab, revealed the most important fact. The slab was the foundation. A tower had once stood here, the 12th, destroyed down to its base, and Vesta recognized its stones in the masonry of the village houses. For centuries, the bearers had been dismantling their only way out to the settlement without realizing it was a way out. That very evening, Aiden gathered everyone together, a squad of 11 bearers, and laid out 3 maps on the table. He spoke as Graven had once spoken to him in the assembly hall, simply and to the point. The keeper's ring on the outside is almost complete. Inside the valley lies the foundation of the 12th beacon, and a stone from that beacon is embedded in the village walls. If we raise the tower on the old foundation and light it, according to Rome's calculations, the domes of the entire chain will close inward, and the beam of light will converge not just anywhere, but right here along the island's border. The sleeper will find himself within the ring of light for the first time in 900 years, neither dead nor victorious, but surrounded. And then it will be possible to speak to him not as a supplicant from the mountain, but as an equal to an equal. The silence at the table lasted a century. Then the oldest bearer, whose name was Hug, and who hadn't picked up a tool in 400 years, stood up. He said that 4 centuries ago, his chain had consisted of 9 lights, and all 9 had gone out in a single autumn after his own. He said that ever since then, he had been counting those lights every night. He picked up Rome's hammer from the table awkwardly, as one might pick up a forgotten craft, and asked where to break down the first wall. The village of bearers took a week to dismantle itself. The houses where they had lived for centuries crumbled stone by stone, and the stone remembered. As soon as the blocks of the old tower were bathed in the light of a lantern, they began to glow faintly on their own without delay, just as a smoldering coal glows if you blow on it. Rome wept over the masonry because it was the first time he'd ever seen stone like that. 11 bearers worked like possessed men and grew younger before our eyes, not in body, but in their eyes. Garth and the archers hauled the blocks. Finn and Coven set up the scaffolding. Vesta operated the pump from the river, and the sleeper watched. The figure on the tower across the river turned its head on the very first day of construction and never looked away again. He didn't interfere. No mist, no hounds, no lullaby. Only once in the middle of the week, a sigh swept through the valley, causing the grass to lie flat. And Erna said that in 900 years, she had never heard anything like it. She said it was like the sigh of a person who had waited a very long time for a letter and then saw the mailman on the road. By the end of the week, something began to happen, what we could only have guessed at inside. The mist above the valley's edges rose like a wall all the way to the stars, and a swirl formed within it. All the fog in the world gathered and slowly swirled around the valley like a gigantic well. And on the night before last, a sound pierced through the swirl, a faint, distant, and rhythmic sound. Someone was striking iron. Vesta listened closely and laughed through her tears because she recognized the pattern of the blows. That was how the Valley of Kos sounded. 3 short, 2 long, the chain's signal meaning, let's go. Mara and Brant's wings did not stop at the closing mass. The chain from the outside set its beacons and pushed its way toward the ring. On the 8th morning, the tower rose to its full height upon its ancient foundation. The bowl awaited oil, and there was just enough oil for a single ignition and 1 night of burning. There was no second time. Aiden stood at the base and looked at his palm. Across the river, on the island, a hunched figure rose to its feet for the first time in 900 years. And then Kovan said the last thing he knew, the thing he had kept to himself until the very end because he was afraid of scaring away hope. He said that the sleeper's proposal, which everyone on the upper platform hears, does not sound the way everyone thinks. The sleeper does not offer to let you take his place. The sleeper offers a choice between 2 words, and in 900 years, no one has been able to choose because both words are true. Kovan said he had no right to speak them in advance. He said only that Aiden would understand the difference between himself and all those who came before when he heard them. All those who came before arrived at the tower with a single flame. Aiden arrived with a chain. Aiden placed his palm on the base. The bowl flared to life, and the sky above the world folded together as one folds one's hands. The 11 domes on the outside and the 12th on the inside closed into a single sphere of light stretching from horizon to horizon. The seams converged over the valley and fell upon the island's border as a ring of white fire stretching from the earth to the stars. The river flared with the reflection. The swirling well of mist on the outside crashed into the light with the full mass of the world and hung there like a fly in amber. And on the island, inside the ring of light, a small, hunched old man stood by the tower and looked across the river at Aiden and across the entire valley, across the water and the light. Aiden heard his true voice for the first time, not in his ears, but in his chest. The voice spoke a single word. At last. There was no bridge across the river, and no bridge was needed. As soon as Aiden approached the water, the ring of light above the island's border parted to the width of a door, and the water beneath that door rose into a ford as solid as glass. The sleeper himself was clearing the way for his guest. Aiden turned to his companions. Vesta kept her hand on the pump feeding the lighthouse's basin. Rome stood with an hourglass, measuring out the oil supply. Kovan and the 10 bearers, she stood in a separate line, watching the ford with the eyes of people who had crossed it only once each and paid for it with centuries of their lives. Garth silently removed Mara's knife, which he had kept since Ashford, and hung it on Aiden's belt. No one said a word of farewell, because any words would have fallen short of the moment. Aiden stepped onto the ford alone with his lantern and walked across the river over the glassy water beneath an arch of light. Up close, the island turned out not to be an island at all, but a memory of an island. The grass here did not grow, but remembered how to grow. The stones of the staircase beneath his feet had been worn into hollows by a single pair of feet over 900 years of walking. At the bottom step lay 4 axes, covered in the dust of the ages, exactly where they had been left. Aiden stepped over them and emerged onto the upper platform. The sleeper was waiting, standing there. Up close, he was small, a gaunt old man, shoulder high to Aiden, dressed in an old-fashioned lighthouse keeper's uniform that had faded to the color of ash. His face was both human and inhuman at once, for a light, constant ripple ran across it like water. Through the old man's features, other features emerged and faded. Thousands of others. All those whom the mist had taken over the course of 9 centuries lived in that face in succession, and Aiden realized he was looking at a living chorus. But the eyes above the ripples were singular and very weary. The old man introduced himself. His name was Ashka, and he was the first bearer. 900 years ago, he was just a lamplighter in a seaside town when the first mist came in from the sea. Back then, it was small, a child of the rift between the world and what lay beneath it. Ashka went out to meet it with an ordinary lantern and ordinary courage, and did the only thing he could think of. He called the mist into himself. He opened himself up, just as one opens a door to a draft, so the draft won't break down the wall. The mist entered and remained, and the lantern in his hand became what it became, an anchor. As long as the fire burned, Ashka held fast to what he had taken in. He withdrew from people into an empty valley so as not to hear their memories, and sat atop a tower to keep watch. But the crack beneath the world did not close. The mist seeped into him drop by drop for all 900 years, and the vessel overflowed. What seeped through him outward, people called fog. The creatures, masks, spinners, the wandering ones, all of this was not an army, but a spill over the edge. The sleeper did not wage war against the world. The sleeper was leaking. Aiden listened, and part of him wanted not to believe it, but the lantern in his hand burned steadily and revealed the truth, just as it always had. There was not a single red dot on the old man. There was nothing vulnerable about him at all, because there was nothing of his own within him except weariness. Ashka continued speaking, and his voice had 2 layers. He knew everything about the chain. The keeper, Olam Tarn, had been his companion for 40 years. The old man from the east was the only one among humans who had thought to come to the edge of the thickness and speak to the mist as if to a person, and the mist answered him with dreams and signs. They had devised the ring of lighthouses together. Ashka himself had provided the calculations for the domes through his dreams because he wanted a cage, not for himself, for what was within him. He had been summoning the light to himself all these months, gathering an army, retreating, and inviting it because, for the first time in 900 years, the world had a chance, and that chance had to be driven here at any cost while the old forces still held out, and he was the one who sent the beast to be chained as well. Aiden choked on it, and Ashka didn't look away. The hounds, the walker, the weaver, all of this was a test to see if he would break. A ring of weak lights would become a ring of false hopes. He broke the chain with all the strength he could muster, so that only the unbreakable chain would remain. 900 years ago, he had bet on his own bravery and lost the world to centuries of fog. The second time, he relied only on what had been proven. Aiden asked about the keeper, about the death in Grey Hall, about the face in Siren, about the fresh letter on the road. Ashka replied that Olam Tarn had come to the thickness to die when he sensed his time had come. He entered the mist of his own accord and gave himself up so he could see the task through from within. Part of him had become trapped in a clump in Siren by chance, while the swarm released by Aiden in Argenti had reached the valley and the old man was now here. Ashka touched his chest. The keeper had lived within the choir and had not dissolved into it, clinging to his mission as if to a handrail. The letter on the road was written by his hand, brought out for a single night, and the words of the letter were true. Then Ashka said what he had been waiting 900 years to say, and he said it as casually as one might talk about the weather. The sentence had always been a choice between two words. The first word was change. Aden sits upon the tower, opens himself, and takes in all of Ashka's essence. Ashka finally dies as a human. The world gains a new sleeper, younger and stronger for the centuries to come, and the chain from outside may even lighten his burden, though it cannot remove it. The crack beneath the world will remain, and drop by drop, it will all repeat itself. All 11 chose to hear this word, and all turned away from it because it is honest and eternal. The second word is let go. Aden, with his ring of light, accomplishes what no single flame could achieve. The ring of seams tightens on the island to its limit, and in the focus of such light, Ashka will be able to unclench his hands. Everything he has held for 900 years will pour out of him all at once. The chorus of thousands upon thousands of captives will be set free, just as the faces were freed from the siren and from the hodnya and will melt away in sparks. Ashka will die free. But beneath the chorus, in the very depths of the receptacle, lies that from which it all began, the child of the crevice, the primordial mist that cannot be dissolved by light because it is not memory, but a whole. When the chorus emerges, the whole will remain bare in the center of the ring, and it will need to be sealed in those few moments while it is still as small as on the first day. Only an anchor can seal it, the living fire that entered the crevice from the other side. Ashka raised his eyes from the ripples and spoke his final words. He is too empty to be an anchor. Only one who is full can become an anchor, a bearer with a burning lantern who will enter the crevice himself and become its seal from within, not the one sleeping in the tower. A door that is closed because the door is the very one who closed it. No one comes out from there. No one lives or dies there. They are held there. That is why the 11 could not choose. The first word was an eternal burden. The second word was more honest and more terrifying because the second word was both the end of the fog and the end of the bearer. Aden stood on the platform and the world below was very quiet. Across the river, his lighthouse burned and his people stood there. Behind the wall of light hung all the fog of the world. Somewhere in that fog, on the other side, Mara was making her way toward him with a second lantern. And then the thought of that second lantern struck Aden so hard that he staggered. He asked Ashka if there could be two anchors. Could the seal be held in place by two flames on either side of the crevice, one inside and one outside? The ripples on the old man's face froze for the first time during the conversation. Thousands of demons froze, and through them emerged something resembling the face of a man who had been solving a problem for 900 years and had heard a move he hadn't seen coming. Ashka said slowly that he didn't know. In 9 centuries, there had never been two lanterns at the same time. The second flame had appeared for the first time, and it had appeared not by design, but of its own accord. He said that if the seal was held by two bound, not by duty, but by blood, then perhaps the door would not need to remain a door forever. Perhaps it could be locked from the outside and the inside at once, and they could walk away, leaving it locked. Perhaps. The word perhaps hung over the clearing like a solitary star. And at that moment, from below the ford, Finn cried out, and his cry was one of joy. Aden turned around. The outer wall of the swirling mist opposite the eastern seam swelled and burst. Through it, a swath of white light poured into the valley, and along that swath walked the light bearers of the column, its two wings merging into one. Ahead, on the first wagon, stood Mara with a lantern above her head, and her dome sliced through the thick fog like a knife cuts through bread. The chain had arrived. 11 outer lights stood behind her, and all the roads of the world converged into a single valley. Ashka gazed at the second light across the valley, and her ripples, very much like tears, streamed down his face. He said that the proposal now sounded different than it had 900 years ago. He said that for the first time, he was asking a question to which he himself did not know the answer. And he asked Aiden if he was ready to call his sister to the tower so that the choice between two words might be heard by two people for the first time. The meeting between brother and sister took place in the middle of the glass ford beneath an arch of light and lasted a single breath because there was no time for more. Mara spoke her mind right away. She already knew. Her hand had listened to the river's entire course, deep within its bed, and as it approached the valley, the sleeper had spoken to her in her dreams for 3 nights in a row, honestly and without concealment, just as he had spoken to the keeper. She climbed the tower not to hear the proposal, but to respond to it. At the top, the two of them stood before Ashka, and the old man looked at them for a long time. Then he said he had to show them something that words lie about, even when they try. He asked for a hand from each of them and warned that it would hurt, not the body. Aiden offered his right hand. Mara offered her damaged one. Ashka took their palms in his hands as dry as ash and, in a single heartbeat, opened the door within himself. For a single heartbeat, Aden was a choir. He was thousands at once. He was a fisherman who had forgotten the sea and a mother who had forgotten her lullaby, and entire cities compressed into a single note. He felt how they were all hanging over the abyss, clinging to a single weary old man, and beneath them, down below, was it? The crevice. Not darkness, nor cold, but an absence so hungry that memory itself flowed toward him like water toward a drain. A single heartbeat, and Ashka unclenched his hands. Aiden came to his senses on his knees. Mara was standing there, blood trickling from her nose, but she stood. She said that now they both knew the value of both words and could decide honestly. They did not decide together. Aiden insisted that the fate of the world not be decided in whispers atop the tower, so a council was convened below in the meadow at the base of the 12th lighthouse, in full view of everyone. The 11 former bearers: Kovan, Vesta, Rome, Hart, Finn, Brandt, who had come with the wing, aged by 10 years from the campaign, and having gained in place of his former greed something resembling faith, Corvus, Bran, Ulma of Solvern, who had come with the northern wing because she said she had to see how what had begun under her watch would end. And Eshka, who was led down from the tower by the arms and who, for the first time in 900 years, stood on the grass among people, and the grass beneath his feet did not wither. Aiden laid it all out, 2 words, the price of the first and the price of the second, and a third path which may not exist. A seal on 2 anchors, where one fire enters the fissure and the other locks it from the outside. And if the bond holds, the inner anchor might be able to emerge, leaving the fissure sealed off from the blocked light of the entire chain. And if it doesn't hold, the world will be left with an open fissure and nothing to stand between it and humanity. The stake of the third path was the entire gain of 900 years. The debate lasted until dark and was the best Aiden had ever heard from people. Hogg, 400 years old, said that those who could not choose for themselves had no right to a voice and therefore asked for only one thing. If permission were granted to let him go, let him stand in the front row when the choir ascended, for among the choir were his 9 extinguished lights. Brandt counted aloud, just as he had counted all his life, only now he was calculating not profit, but the risk to the 3,000 souls in the valley, and his calculation struck the merchant as strange. He said that for 40 years he had bought cheap and sold dear, but here, for the first time, he saw a deal where paying everything and receiving everything were one and the same line. Vesta spoke of the Earth's core. She said that the fissure was a wound in the world, and wounds aren't sealed with stone forever. They're closed so that the edges can grow together. A living anchor in the wound is a suture, not a plug, and a suture can one day be removed if the wound heals. Her words carried more weight than anyone else's. Rome remained silent throughout the argument, then went over to the table with the calculations and did what he always did. He killed the excess with numbers. He said that the question of the 2 anchors was not a matter of faith, but a matter of geometry. The ring's seams converge at a focal point on the island. If, at the moment the choir emerges, both lanterns are positioned at the focal point on either side of the crevice, then the density of light in the beam will be unlike anything that has ever existed anywhere, not even in the Valley of Cause. He cannot promise that the inner one will emerge. He can promise that if the inner one can emerge under any conditions at all, it will only be under these. Ashka spoke last. And he spoke briefly. He said that over 900 years he had learned one thing. The mist cannot be defeated by force because it does not fight, and it cannot be outlasted because it never tires. It can only be held back, and the question has always been simply whether one person holds it back or everyone does. The first way is when one person holds it back. The third path is when everyone holds it, because the seal of the two fires stands upon a ring of 12 beacons, and the ring stands upon thousands of people who carry oil, repair the bowls, and tell the children why the light burns. He said that for 900 years he had been the pillar of the world, and for the first time he saw the possibility of becoming a part of it rather than its sole pillar. And if the young are ready to risk everything, then the Rick asks for the honor of unclenching his hands. They voted at dawn by a show of hands, and there were no hands raised in opposition. The word was spoken. Let it go. And a third path to boot, because as Garth said with his scar across his face, if you're going to stake everything, you might as well stake it on your own terms. For 3 days, the valley prepared for the world's final task. Rome and Vesta recalculated the focus and adjusted the mirrors on all 12 bowls of the ring via the dove-carried light signals. The oil was drained into a single system, and Homeguard's mountain oil was enough for 6 hours of all the lights burning at full capacity at once. 6 hours for 900 years worth of contents. Kovan and the carriers marked out an exit circle on the island, and Mara was learning the final craft from Ashki, how to hold the door. The old man passed on to her through her dreams, a skill that had no name, and after each night she awoke with eyes that were wiser and hands that were calmer. Her cursed hand had changed over those 3 days. The gray roots on her wrist hadn't disappeared, but had turned white, and Ashka said that was as it should be. The curse, having lived a year beside the light, became a translator. Mara's hand understood both languages, those of the mist and of fire, and that was precisely why she alone could be the second anchor. There wasn't even a moment's debate over who would be the first anchor, who would enter inside, and Aiden quashed all attempts to start that argument. The senior lantern of the divisions is stronger than the bundle, and she is his sister. Period. On the last evening, Aiden made his rounds of the camp, just as Greyhall had once done. He sat by the Eschforder's campfire, where Garth was telling the newcomers about the platform and the Green Lantern. He found Finn, who was oiling his bow, and told him that if anything went wrong in the morning, he would have to shoot not into the mist, but at the bowl of the 12th lighthouse to bring the dome crashing inward and seal off the valley with everything inside. Finn nodded and didn't ask a single question, and that was the most terrifying agreement of Aiden's life. He found Brant and gave him a letter for Grevin and Greyhall, just in case. Brant took the letter and for the first time since they'd met, embraced him silently like a father. That night, Aiden and Mara sat together on the upper platform of the tower next to Ashka, gazing at the ring of lights on the horizon. 12 white dots stood in a circle around the world, and between them, along the seams of the domes, a faint glow flowed so that the entire valley lay within a luminous sphere like a pearl in a shell. Mara asked her brother if he remembered how, a year ago, he'd been afraid of losing her in a month. Aiden replied that he remembered every day of that month. She said that in the morning they would guard a single door from both sides, and that she had dreamed her whole life of being his equal in at least one thing, and it had turned out even better than that. Ashka listened to them, and the ripples on his face were as still as water at night. He said that over 900 years he had forgotten how to feel envy, and now he remembered how it was done At dawn, the valley was built. All the people formed a chain behind the river on the outer meadow, standing in a solid ring of faces. The pumps reached full pressure. 12 bowls along the horizon roared with fire at full strength, and the seams of the domes swelled to the density of milk. Aiden, holding a lantern, stood on the marked circle in the center of the island. Mara, with her own lantern, stood opposite him, 3 steps away. Ashka stepped out between them into the center of the circle, small, upright, and almost transparent, for the ripples on his face had dissolved into a continuous shimmer. The choir within knew. The choir stood at the door. The old man looked east, where the sun was rising above the horizon, and 12 lights greeted it as an equal. Then he looked at Aiden and Mara and spoke the final words of the first bearer. He said, "Thank you for making it this far." He said, "Hold on tight," and he unclenched his hands. At first, there was neither a rumble nor a flash. There was such immense relief that the entire valley felt it all at once, just as one senses a change in the weather. A spring compressed for 900 years began to uncoil, and light streamed out from the little old man in the circle. The choir emerged. The first clusters rose from Ashki's chest unhurriedly, like the first bubbles from the bottom of boiling water. Then there were dozens of them. Then the count vanished. From the shimmering body, a river of warm light surged upward, and the river widened with every breath. The wisps passed through the dense air beneath the closed domes, and in that air, what the ring had been built for took place within them. They did not simply melt away. They managed to remember themselves. Above the valley, for a few moments, the faces, homes, and voices of the past appeared and faded. An entire 9th century fishing village passed over the river with its scent of tar and the cries of seagulls. A 300-year-old wedding song rang out from one end to the other and died away. The people in the outer meadow stood with their heads thrown back, weeping not out of grief. Past them, the memory of the world, which they had believed to be lost forever, rose upward, and that memory took its leave. Hug stood in the front row as he had asked, and when 9 small lights passed overhead in formation, like 9 of his extinguished lighthouses, the 400-year-old bearer bowed to the ground before them. Olma saw in the stream the face of a young and vibrant Kovan, though the old Kovan stood beside her, and the 2 Kovans looked at each other across a century and nodded. Vesta found with her eyes her 3 masters who had not lived to see Argent. Corvus found his soldiers. Everyone in the valley found someone of their own in the river of light because the river carried everyone. Aiden stood in the circle and held fast. The work of the anchor turned out to be not a feat but a labor. The river of light flowed between his lantern and Mara's lantern as between 2 banks, and the banks had to remain steadfast. Each emerging cluster pulled a thread behind it, and the threads clung to the flames of the lanterns, aligned themselves with them, and rose upward evenly. As soon as Aiden's flame wavered, the river began to swirl in a funnel back toward the bottom. He held the lantern with both hands and spoke aloud to the fire as if to a horse at a ford. Mara, across from him, did the same, and her pale hand rested on the lantern's glass directly over the flame without burning. The translator was at work. She sensed the river through and, with a cry, corrected her brother before his flame had time to waver. Ashka was melting away. An hour later, less than half of him remained, and what was left was becoming increasingly human. The ripples were thinning because there was less and less of the foreign element left in him. 3 hours later, standing within the circle was simply a very old man, through whom the last thousands of lights passed, and his face was his own, and on that face was an expression that no living person had ever seen. This is what a debtor who has paid everything looks like. As the 5th hour drew to a close, the river dwindled to a stream, then to drops. The last to emerge from Ashka was a mass that did not ascend. It hovered before Aiden, taking on for a moment the form of a man with narrowed eyes and scorched eyebrows, and Ola Tarn looked upon his heir one last time. The keeper smiled, raised his hand, whether in farewell or blessing, and went upward to catch up with the choir. And then the silence of the 6th hour fell. Ashka was empty. He stood in the circle, light as paper, looking at his hands and laughing silently because those hands were his alone. And beneath him, at the center of the circle, the air began to darken. The fissure was rising. Without the choir, nothing covered it, and it rose from beneath the world, naked and hungry. It was small, a hole of darkness the size of a well's mouth hanging over the stone, and its smallness made it more terrifying than the walk, because the walk was a consequence, while this was the cause. The light from the lanterns did not burn it. The light broke off at its edge just as sound breaks off in cotton wool. The grass around the circle lay flat toward it. The river swayed toward the island. Everything that possessed memory was drawn toward the absence of memory, like water toward a drain, and Aiden felt this pull with his whole body. It was time to close it. Ashka stepped out of the circle of his own accord, for nothing was holding him there anymore. As he passed Aiden, he touched his shoulder with a hand as light as a leaf and spoke one final word. "You don't stay inside by force." Aiden didn't have time to ask what he meant. The crack, sensing it was alone, began to grow. Aiden looked at Mara through the circle. His sister stood with a lantern, her white hand over the flame, and nodded to him the way she used to nod across the table when they were children, conspiring about something without words against the whole world. He smiled at her. He raised the lantern and stepped into the hole. The world ended without warning. There was no longer any up or down, no heat or cold, no body, and no time. Aiden hung in the void, and the void immediately began to consume him. It drew not his blood nor his life from him, but his very self. His name floated away first. He caught it as one catches a hat in the wind. Aiden, the cart driver from Grey Hall, Mara's brother. The pull grew stronger, and he realized how this would end. The rift would drink his memory faster than he could hold on to it, and all that would remain of his anchor would be an empty lantern. And here, emptiness is not a seal, but sustenance. Holding on wasn't a matter of strength. Ashki's words caught up with him in the darkness, and Aiden did what the entire chain had been doing all this year. Ever since that first night in Grey Hall, he began to tell his story out loud in a voice that hadn't been here before. He began to recount his memories to the rift himself. Not to give away, but to tell, as one tells by the campfire, whispering a neighbor's name and 3 cherished memories. He told of the ringing of the bell and the smell of kerosene in the house by the palisade, of how Mara forgot her mother's name and how she called her brother by name within the circle of light, about the cart driver's lewd song in Saul Verne's ring, about Bran's hammer and the mirror from the door of Brant's cabinet, about how the Kos Valley thundered and how Rome wept over the glowing stone. The memory he recounted did not fade away. The memory he recounted rose up around him in the darkness, just as logs seasoned in the light rise up, and the crack could not drink it, because a story is memory turned outward, and one can drink only what lies silently within. Aiden was building. He was building a log cabin from his life around the hole from the inside, and every story was a crown. From the outside, Mara saw the hole twitch, stop growing, and a thin white border run along its edge. She screamed at the chains holding her and pressed her flame against the edge from the outside. A white hand entered the darkness up to the wrist and did not disappear. The world spent a year learning to live without the fog, and that year was the hardest of the easy ones. For the first few weeks, the valley didn't clear. People were afraid to believe it, and every morning the lookouts climbed the ridges to search for the gray, but found only the weather. Ordinary weather. The river mists of dawn, which they first shied away from, but then laughed at themselves for doing so, because this mist smelled of water, birds sang within it, and it melted away by breakfast time just as steam should. Vesta was the first to articulate the world's new law. She said that from now on, mist was simply water again, and water was no enemy of memory. The seal was checked every day. The white ring in the island's stone lay warm and motionless, and Mara, whose hand had remained the interpreter forever, reported the same thing over and over. It was quiet behind the door. The pull from the other side hadn't disappeared, but it was now steady and faint, like a current beneath the ice, and the seal, held by 2 hinges, kept it in place not by force, but by its very existence. Rome built a chapel without walls over the ring, simply a roof supported by 12 pillars and a small fire, always burned in the chapel, from which anyone who came could light their lamp. They dispersed in waves. First to leave was Corvus's wing, setting out to restore the plains of Midra, and half the Argentines went with him. Then Brant led the caravans eastward. His caravans carried not goods, but seeds, tools, and lists of the living for those who had counted their own as dead for a year. Coven returned to Sulfurn. He entered the village where he had died 20 years ago in broad daylight, and Olma led him by the arm through the crowd of stunned villagers to his own house, which the village had left unoccupied all these years out of superstition.
The other bearers scattered across the world to search for what remained of their chains, and Hogg was the last to leave, carrying a handful of soil from the island. Ashka remained in the valley. He asked to be appointed keeper of the 12th lighthouse, and for half a year faithfully tended the lamp, trimmed the wick, and taught the settlers' children to read and write.
He aged rapidly and happily, as if his body were in a hurry to live out what remained unlived. He died in his sleep that spring in his guardhouse by the tower, and on his face they found the same expression as that of a debtor who had paid his debt. The entire valley buried him, and on the stone, in accordance with his will, they carved not a name or dates, but 3 words he had held fast. Aiden saw the old man off and realized that his own work too was nearing its end. The chain no longer needed a leader to walk ahead. The chain needed order, and order was built better without him than with him. The ring of 12 lighthouses became the backbone of a new country that no one had declared a country. Roads were laid along the seams of the domes because there was never any banditry at the seams. Greyhall had tripled in size, and Grevin wrote that a second fair had to be set up at the eastern gates. Ashford was cutting stone for half the world. Holmgart once again held the pass, but now charged a toll not in steel but in the form of a school of mining. In Argenta, Vesta had established mines, and Argenta's silver went toward mirrors for the new small beacons that the cities were now erecting on their own without any maps, simply because that had become the custom. The light of the miracle had become a craft, and that was the only true destiny of the miracle. One final duty remained, and Aiden fulfilled it that fall. He walked the entire route from the valley to Greyhall on foot, just as the caretaker had once dreamed of doing. In each of the 12 settlements, he did the same thing. He gathered the townspeople in the town square, placed his lantern in a prominent spot, and recounted everything from the bell above Greyhall to the white ring in the stone, without embellishing a thing. He spoke of Irvos, and of how Toller had nearly surrendered the gates, about the bargain with Brant and the order given to Finn on that last night, about how the sleeper turned out to be the first among them, not the last of the monsters. He told these stories because he had come to understand in the crack of time the price of a memory that had been spoken aloud. A world that remembers aloud cannot be drunk. In Greyhall, in the square, by the well where Mara once sat with her arm bandaged, he finished his story and did what he had come to do. He removed the lock, invisible to anyone but the bearers, from the rim of the lantern, and announced that from now on the lantern would not choose an heir upon the master's death. From now on, the flame would be passed on as the caretaker had passed it on to him, through trust and while the bearer was still alive. As his first apprentice, he chose the daughter of the archer Finn, a 12-year-old girl who, unlike everyone else in the square, hadn't cried when she heard about the crack, but had instead asked what had been used to caulk it. The lantern in her hands flared to life at her first touch, and Aiden laughed louder than anyone else then, because the fire had chosen just as it always had. Not a strong one, but a curious one. In the winter, he returned to the valley and stayed. He and Mara built a house on the outer meadow, its windows facing the island, and their life became the kind about which stories are not written. Mara married Garth, and her white hand rocked the cradle as calmly as it held the door to the world. Aiden watched from behind the lighthouse, teaching the arriving bearers, whose numbers grew with each passing year, because small lanterns had begun to light up all over the land of their own accord among all sorts of people, and no one was surprised anymore. After 900 years of starvation, the world was gorging itself on light. Once a year, on the day the crevice closed, the entire chain gathered in the valley. People came from Greyhall and Argent, from Midra, and from the Ridge. And in the evening, 3,000 lights formed a ring around the island, recreating the ancient formation, but not for war. People simply stood with their lamps and shared aloud with one another their 3 most cherished memories, just as Mara had once taught them on the plain. The ritual was called the recitation, and the children thought it had always been that way. But 7 years later, something happened that made it worth finishing this story. During the 7th Progavore, Mara, standing by the seal, suddenly raised her hand and asked for silence. 3,000 lights fell silent. She sank to her knees, placed her white palm on the warm ring in the stone, and listened for a long time. Then she stood up, turned to her brother, and everyone saw that she was smiling and crying at the same time. She said that the pull had ended completely. There was no longer any pull beyond the door because, according to her hand, the edges of the wound had come together. Vesta had been right in that long-ago argument in the meadow. A living suture had allowed the wound to heal, whereas a dead plug would never have allowed it. The crack beneath the world didn't close with a seal. The crack closed on its own beneath the seal, just as bone heals beneath the periosteum. Aiden stepped forward, placed his palm next to his sister's, and felt the same thing. A smooth, warm nothingness, stone like stone. The door they had held on both sides for 7 years ceased to be a door and became simply a space. He took Mara's knife from his belt, the very one with which he had once entered Ashford, and, out of old habit, tested the ring with the blade. The steel clanged against solid rock. That night, for the first time in 7 years, the ring's beacons were dimmed to a low flame, not out of necessity, but by right, and the sky above the valley revealed to the people more stars than any living generation had ever seen. Aiden stood on the platform of the 12th tower, where 900 years ago a hunched old man had sat holding his lantern in his hands. The 12 divisions on the rim burned evenly. The flame stood still, and there was no longer any shadow within it, for there was nothing left to reveal. There were no traps left. Nothing remained hidden. The world lay illuminated and honest all the way to the horizon, and the light from the weapon had finally become what it was intended to be. Simply a light by which one could see the path. Down below, at the base of the tower, Finn's daughter, now a grown woman and a bearer, was arguing with the young people about whether it was even necessary to keep lighting the beacons every night. And Aiden listened to this debate from above with pleasure, because it was a debate among the well-fed about luxuries, not among the hungry about their very survival. He did not intervene. He knew the answer and knew they would come to it on their own. The lighthouses would burn not against the darkness, because that darkness no longer existed. The lighthouses would burn as a fire burns in the window of a house, so that those coming from afar might see that they were being awaited. Aiden raised the lantern for the last time in this story and looked through the glass toward the east, where, beyond 11 lights, beyond the ridge and the plains, stood Greyhall, where it all began. Somewhere out there on the eastern wall, a sentry now stood, gazing out at the bare hills and yawning out of boredom. And that boredom was the greatest victory of all. Aiden smiled, adjusted the wick to a steady, low flame, and walked down the worn steps to have supper, because Mara was calling, and everyone in this house obeyed her. He left the lantern burning on the landing, not as a weapon nor as a seal, but just as one leaves a light in a window, just in case, as a fond memory, forever.